Aaron Vosk woke up when frost dripped from the ceiling onto his face. He was lying there, wrapped in 3 blankets, and still couldn't feel his toes. It was the 47th day of the cold snap. The thermometer outside the window read -54. The town of Norfolk was dying in silence. Aaron sat up and rubbed his face with his palms. His breath hung in the room as a white cloud and wouldn't dissipate. He mentally tallied his supplies: 4 cans of stewed meat, half a pack of crackers, half a kilo of rice. That would last 5 days. Then the starvation would begin. He got up and started moving because staying still here meant death. Today he was going to climb to the upper floors of the tower. No one went up there. The stairs were icy, and 2 people had already fallen into the void. But the lower floors had been completely ransacked a month ago. Aaron wrapped wire around his boots for traction. His hands remembered how to tie knots properly in the cold. He used to do this every day at work, and now that knowledge was keeping him alive. He grabbed a crowbar and a flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was pitch black and echoing. Every step reverberated 3 floors up. On the 6th floor, he heard a door slam below. One of the residents had gone to burn furniture in the common hall. There were about 30 people left in the tower. A month ago, there had been 90. Aaron climbed to the 9th floor and stopped in front of a door with a bronze nameplate. The nameplate was covered in frost. He pried the door open with the crowbar. The lock snapped open with a dry click. It was even colder inside than on the staircase. The apartment's owner was sitting in an armchair by the window, staring at the city with white eyes. He had frozen to death long ago. Aaron bowed his head briefly and walked past. He was no longer afraid of the dead. He was afraid only of empty shelves. The kitchen turned out to be well stocked. 6 cans of preserves, grains, tea, honey in a glass jar, hard as a rock. Aaron packed everything into his backpack and went to check the rooms. The second room was a study. Along the walls stood cabinets with glass doors. The owner had been collecting things his whole life: coins, model ships, porcelain figurines. Aaron ran the flashlight listlessly along the shelves. All of this was now worth less than a single galette. The beam hit the bottom shelf, and something there caught the light. Aaron crouched down. Behind the glass stood a snow globe, an ordinary souvenir about the size of 2 fists, a glass sphere on a dark wooden base. Inside, he could see a tiny house with a red roof and white flakes of artificial snow. Aaron stared at it longer than he intended to. In this dead, icy city, someone had kept a toy winter on a shelf. It was almost funny. He opened the door and took the snow globe in his hand. And then the first strange thing happened. The snow globe was warm. Not warmed by anything else, but warm in and of itself, like the palm of a living person. Aaron pulled off his glove and wrapped his bare fingers around the glass. The warmth traveled up his wrist. His fingers, which he hadn't felt since that morning, began to tingle like needles. He stood in the middle of the freezing office, warming his hands against the souvenir. His mind told him that wasn't possible. His palms told him it did. He tucked the sphere into his jacket and headed for the exit. At the office threshold, he glanced back at the dead owner and said aloud that he was taking the toy as part of the inheritance. The dead man didn't object. The descent took an hour. Back in his apartment, the first thing Aaron did was place the sphere on the table and sit down across from it. The heat from the sphere could be felt at arm's length. The temperature near it was about 10 degrees higher than in the rest of the room. Aaron pulled his chair closer and began to examine his find. The little house inside was intricately crafted. A porch, shutters, a chimney on the roof. He turned the snow globe and noticed that the snow inside wasn't settling as it should, but was slowly swirling on its own. Without any shaking, Aaron froze. The snowflakes inside moved in a circle like a living blizzard in miniature. He brought the snow globe up to his eyes and thought he'd like to get a closer look at the little house. The world gave a jolt. The table slipped from under his elbows. Aaron was standing in the snow in front of a little house with a red roof. and the house came up to his chest. Above his head, instead of the sky, hung a glass dome in which his own room loomed, murky and immense. He looked up at it from below, from inside the sphere. His legs gave way, and he sat down right in the snow. The snow was cold, but ordinary. The air here was fresh and barely frosty. Aaron sat there, breathing, and counted his breaths to keep from panicking. On the count of 40, he stood up. The space inside turned out to be round and small, about 12 steps across. Beyond it stood a soft white wall that looked like thick fog. Aaron pressed his palms against it. The wall gave way slightly, but wouldn't let him through. He returned to the center and thought he wanted to go outside. The world shifted again. He was standing at the table in his apartment, and the ball was lying in front of him. Aaron wiped his face and realized he was smiling for the first time in 47 days. For the next 3 hours, he conducted experiments like a man possessed. Here's what he discovered. Whatever he touched and mentally sent into the sphere ended up inside it. The object would shrink to a size proportional to the space available and appear in the snow. The objects returned to their original size, whole and unharmed. Aaron sent a stool inside, then a bucket of water. The water didn't spill or freeze. Then a can of stewed meat. Then he tried sending a bed. The sphere grew heavier in his hand, and the bed fit only halfway inside. There wasn't any more room. Aaron stood over the sphere, realizing that he was holding the most valuable object in this dying world. A warm, fireproof storage space that couldn't be robbed. A shelter that fit in his pocket. He moved the bed, all his supplies, and a box of candles inside. The space was nearly filled to capacity. A one-step passage remained between the bed and the little house. It was cramped, but inside it was +5 when it was -54 outside. Aaron decided that tonight, for the first time in a month and a half, he would sleep in the warmth. He had already begun to drift off when a sound came from the street. A long, screeching howl. No dog had ever howled like that. Aaron went to the window and looked down through the ice. A creature was walking down the deserted avenue between the frozen-in cars. It was the size of a calf. Its body was made of gray ice and veins of frost. It moved in jerks, swiveling its blind snout with the wind. And in its chest, beneath the crust of ice, something bright was burning, round and blue, like a small, evil sun. The creature stopped in front of the tower. It slowly turned its snout and looked directly at Aaron's window. Aaron recoiled from the window and extinguished the lantern. His heart was pounding in his throat. He stood in the darkness and listened. There was a screech from below, then a crash. The creature was smashing the front door. Aaron grabbed a crowbar and stepped out onto the stairwell. The logic was simple. Inside the apartment, it would corner him. On the staircase, he had the height, the steps, and the ice he knew by heart. A chill was rising up from below through the landings. Not the usual cold, but a different kind, biting. It made his eyes water and turned the metal of the railing white. The creature was coming, carrying its own frost with it. Aaron stood on the 4th floor landing, right above the slipperiest flight of stairs. A week ago, he himself had poured 2 buckets of water there to scare off the marauders. Now it was his trap. The creature appeared in the flight of stairs below. Up close, it looked even worse than from a distance. A snout without eyes, a mouth full of 3 rows of icy needles. A blue core in its chest pulsed, and with every thud against the walls, frost spread out. The creature sensed him and lunged upward. On the icy staircase, its paws slipped apart. It slammed its chin against the steps and skidded. Aaron leaped down from the landing and put all his weight into the blow. The crowbar drove into the creature's chest, striking the blue glow precisely. The crunch sounded as if a frozen tree trunk had snapped. The creature thrashed. It lashed out with a paw and tore through Aaron's sleeve, along with his skin. He leaned into the scrap metal and twisted it. The glow beneath the creature's skin flickered and went out. Its body slumped and crumbled into a heap of murky ice. The core remained lying on the steps amid the shards, a blue sphere the size of an apple. It still glowed faintly from within, with a residual light. Aaron stood over it, breathing heavily and clutching his lacerated forearm. And then the sphere in his bosom stirred on its own. He jerked toward the core like a compass needle toward the north. Aaron pulled out the sphere. The glass drew his hand down toward the blue light. Inside the sphere, a blizzard swirled rapidly and voraciously. Aaron pressed the sphere tightly against the core. The core flared up. Light flowed from it into the glass in a single long stream. The core's empty shell crumbled to dust, and the sphere in his palms grew warm and seemed to breathe in. Aaron felt it with his fingers. The sphere became deeper. He didn't know how to explain that word, but it was accurate. He went up to his apartment. He bandaged his hand. He sat down and transported himself inside. The space expanded. There had been 12 steps. Now there were 30. The bed and the boxes that had taken up the entire space an hour ago now stood in a tight cluster in the middle of a wide circle of snow. The air warmed to a noticeable above-freezing temperature. Aaron walked from one end of the space to the other and laughed out loud. The creature's cores were expanding the sphere. The rule had been established. He lay down on the bed beneath the glass dome and slept for 10 hours straight in the warmth and silence. He didn't dream at all, and it was the best sleep he'd had all winter. In the morning, he went outside, and the world outside seemed even more terrifying to him than before, because now he had something to compare it to. For the next 3 days, Aaron studied the rules. He did this methodically, writing everything down in a notebook. The habit of keeping records had stayed with him from his previous job, where a mistake in the records could cost an entire complex its harvest. The rules turned out to be as follows. Time passed at the same rate inside and outside. The air inside refreshed itself. The fire inside burned steadily, and the smoke vanished into thin air. Living things were transported just as easily as dead ones. He tested this on a rat he'd caught in the basement. The rat was transported and ran around in the snow, and it survived. From the outside, the sphere was impenetrable. Aaron struck it with a hammer, and the glass didn't even make a sound. And most importantly, as long as Aaron was inside, the sphere turned dull and gray on the outside, like an ordinary cheap trinket. The shelter hid itself. On the 4th day, Holt tracked him down. The tower supervisor, a heavy-set, distrustful man who had worked as a security guard until the cold set in and, with the onset of winter, had taken on the task of keeping track of the residents and the firewood. Holt stopped Aaron in the lobby and stared at his face for a long time. Then he said that everyone in the building was as gray as ash, but Vosk was rosy-cheeked, as if he were sleeping in a sanatorium. He asked where Vosk was keeping warm and why he didn't smell of smoke. Aaron replied that he'd found a warm spot by the ventilation shaft. Holt said the shafts had frozen solid a month ago and that he'd personally checked them. Aaron shrugged and walked away. He could feel a gaze on his back. Holt didn't believe a single word. That evening, Aaron noticed that someone had tried to open the door to his apartment. The scratches on the lock were fresh. He gathered all his belongings inside the sphere, and from that day on, the apartment became an empty box, while his entire life hung on a cord around his neck. The problem lay elsewhere. The supplies inside would last a week. A space 30 paces wide couldn't feed him. It could only store things. Aaron laid out his finds from the past week on the snow and counted them aloud. 7 days' worth of food, 20 candles, enough bandages for 2 dressings. He looked at the white wall of fog surrounding him and told himself that the wall had to recede. He needed projectiles, lots of projectiles, and the projectiles were carried in the chests of creatures that could rip a man apart with a single paw. He spent 2 days preparing. He found a fire hook in the fire cabinet and cut it down to a manageable length. He sharpened the the end on concrete. He wove a gauntlet out of wire for his left hand. He studied the tracks in the snow to see where the creatures were going. The tracks converged on an old heating plant at the edge of the neighborhood. The creatures were drawn to the remnants of heat like moths to a lamp. On the morning of the 6th day, Aaron set out to hunt. He moved along the walls on the shady side. The frost was so biting that the air rang with a chill. At the heating plant, he found the first creature, a small one, about the size of a dog. It was gnawing on a heating pipe. Aaron crept up from downwind and struck the blue glow from top to bottom with his pickaxe. The creature died instantly. The core was small, about the size of a walnut. The sphere consumed it, and the space expanded by 4 steps. Aaron nodded to himself. The math added up. A small core equaled 4 steps. A large one, like the first creature's, was 18. He moved on along the heating pipeline, and after 100 meters, he emerged from behind a transformer shed, right into an open area. Creatures stood in the middle of the heating plant's courtyard. He counted 9, small ones, medium ones, and in the center of the yard sat one large one, the size of a bull. Frost from its breath settled on the walls within a 3-meter radius, and all 9 snouts turned simultaneously toward the man with the pickaxe. It was too late to run. The creatures could sprint faster than a human, and Aaron knew this from their tracks. He did the only thing he had time for. He stepped back behind the transformer shed into a narrow passage between the shed and the concrete fence. The passage was less than a meter wide. A large creature wouldn't be able to turn around here, and the smaller ones could only pass one at a time. The first one burst into the passage a second later. Aaron met it head-on with his pickaxe. The core burst, and the creature crumbled to pieces. The second one leaped over a pile of ice, and he struck it mid-leap, but missed the projectile. The tip pierced its shoulder. The creature slammed him against the fence. The needles in its jaws clicked right against his throat. Aaron rammed the pike's blade into its jaw and drove the pike deeper with his knee. On the second swing, the blade cracked. He took down the third and fourth in quick succession because the passageway was working in his favor. The fifth one turned out to be smarter. She climbed up onto the roof of the booth. Aaron saw the shadow, fell onto his back, and impaled the creature on the blade he'd thrust out. Her weight nearly dislocated his arm. The 6th and 7th hesitated at the entrance to the passageway, and then the courtyard shook. The big one was coming toward him. She couldn't get into the passageway, so she simply rammed the booth with her shoulder. The concrete cracked. Aaron knew the wall wouldn't hold up to a third blow. He did something he wouldn't have dared to do a week ago. He leaped out of the passageway right in front of the big creature's snout. He dove under the swing of its paw, and he pressed his palm, holding the orb, into its chest, right where, beneath the crust of ice, a core the size of a child's head was burning, and in his mind, he yanked that core inward. The orb howled. There was no other word for it. A blizzard swirled like a funnel inside the glass. Light from the creature's chest flowed into the sphere in a thick blue strand. The creature thrashed and pounded with its paws. One paw caught Arena and flung him 5 meters away. He skidded across the ice and leaped back up. The giant stood there, swaying. The light in her chest dimmed as it was drained from a distance. Then she collapsed and crumbled. The remaining creatures turned and left without looking back. The pack died along with its leader. Aaron sat on the ice in the middle of the courtyard, laughing like a madman, unable to stop. The sphere on his chest was hot and heavy with the power he'd absorbed. Inside, space burst outward. He could feel it even from the outside. What followed wasn't life, but a montage. That's what he called it. Weeks merged into a series of vivid snapshots. Here he was, tracking the creatures by their frosty trails and taking 2 cores a day, and the white wall inside the sphere recedes and recedes. Now the space reaches 300 steps, and he stops measuring in steps and begins to measure by walking time. Here he's driving a dump truck full of fertile soil, found frozen solid in the Agribase's hangar, into the sphere. An entire dump truck fits inside the sphere in one go because now the volume allows it. Here he's been hauling chunks of ice for a week and piling them in a depression, and the ice inside melts on its own, forming a lake in which the glassy sky is reflected. Here he is opening the agricultural base's seed warehouse, and his hands sort the bags on their own. Tomatoes, cucumbers, barley, potatoes, soybeans. He reads the labels faster than he thinks. For 10 years, he designed irrigation systems for greenhouse complexes, and now he sketches irrigation ditches in the snow with a stick, knowing the drawing is accurate. Here are the first sprouts, green stubble on a black garden bed beneath a glass sky. Aaron crouches in front of the bed for an hour, simply watching. Outside, it's -61 that day. He brought the people inside at the end of the 2nd month, not according to plan, but because he had no other choice. He was returning from a hunt when he found a girl and a boy in the entryway on the 1st floor, Martha and her brother Tim. They'd come from the neighboring block where everything had ended. Martha was holding a sharpened piece of rebar in her hand, shielding her brother, and said they needed nothing but a spot out of the wind. Her lips were black from frostbite. Tim had stopped shivering. Aaron knew what that meant. A person who has stopped shivering but is still freezing to death will die within hours. He crouched down and said he had a spot sheltered from the wind, but they would have to believe in the impossible. Martha replied that she would gladly believe in the impossible because, in the realm of the possible, they were already dead. A minute later, the 3 of them were standing in the snow beneath the glass dome, and Tim was crying because his fingers hurt in the warmth, while Martha ran her hand over the green sprouts and kept repeating that this couldn't be happening. She stayed, and within a week she was tending the garden beds better than he was. He brought Holt over himself. He came to his tiny room, where the tower supervisor was poring over the list of residents and crossing out yet another name. Aaron said he'd show him his cozy little spot. Holt snorted and went along because he didn't believe it. He still didn't believe it on the stairs. He didn't believe it when Aaron pulled out the ball. He stood there with the stony face of a man who'd been deceived for 40 years by anyone and everyone. And then came the shift. Aaron wasn't looking at the space around them, but at Holt's face. The face cracked. The stony mask slipped away, revealing an old man standing ankle-deep in lush grass, holding a green tomato in the palm of his hand, his chin trembling. Holt was silent for about 5 minutes. Then he said that there were 26 survivors in the tower, and that if wax didn't take them all away, he, Holt, would die of shame before he died of the cold. Aaron replied that he would take them all, but from that day on, Holt would be responsible for order and keeping track of everyone, because no one could do it better than him. So people appeared inside, 29 people on the shore of the lake. They were brought inside the house. That was a joy in itself. Aaron would place his palm on the frozen garden shed outside, and the shed would appear inside on the snow, complete with furniture and dishes. A street grew, then a second one. Someone was the first to call the settlement Hearthholm, and the name stuck. In the evenings, smoke rose above the roofs, and the air smelled of bread, because they'd found flour, they'd found an oven, and they'd found old Ingrid, who knew how to talk to that oven. Aaron went outside every other day. Singer for nuts became a job. The community needed to grow because Holt kept track of everything, and the numbers spoke for themselves. 29 mouths to feed, that's a lot. The fields would yield a harvest in a month. Until the harvest, they needed canned goods, and canned goods were running out throughout the entire neighborhood. On his next outing, Aaron broke into the supply depot's warehouse and heard engines. He extinguished his lantern and lay flat behind a stack of crates. Vehicles were driving down the avenue past the base. 3 tracked tractors with homemade armor made of sheet metal. A grate had been welded onto the lead vehicle, and a human skeleton was bolted to the grate with wire. The convoy passed by and stopped a kilometer away at the water tower. Aaron lay there watching. He'd heard about these people from Marta, the Iron Convoy, a gang that majestic through dead cities, ransacking everything down to the last can and taking the survivors as chained laborers. They were led by a man named Krieger. That night, Aaron returned to Hartholm and recounted what he had seen. Holt listened and said in an even voice that the convoy had stopped in their neighborhood for a reason. For a month, a rumor had been creeping through the ruins about a man who didn't feel the cold and about people who had vanished from the tower one day, entire families, leaving no left any traces. Such a rumor precedes a man like the smell of food, and people like Krieger follow that scent precisely. The morning after Holt's words, Aaron gathered all the adults around the stove in the house. He laid a map of the neighborhood, drawn in charcoal, on the table and told them the truth. The convoy consists of 30 guns and 3 vehicles. Hartholm is like a ball on a string. If Krieger takes Aaron from the outside, he'll take everyone inside as well. That means only he himself is allowed to go outside now, and only along scouted routes. Martha asked why they couldn't just wait it out inside until the convoy left. Holt answered for him. The record showed they had enough canned food for 9 days, but the harvest wouldn't be ready for another 26. A 17-day gap meant 17 days of starvation for 29 people. There was no point in waiting it out. Aaron added that there was a second reason. The convoy had started burning down houses. Krieger was smoking out the neighborhood like you'd smoke a fox out of its den. Every day of waiting meant that someone's neighbors in the ruins were freezing to death. So they made a decision. Aaron goes out at night and carries food from the warehouses inside before the convoy can get to it. That's how the second war began. A silent one. Aaron would slip into the darkness and place his hands on the stacks, and entire warehouses would vanish right under Krieger's nose. He took over the food depot. He took over the restaurant's basement. He took the truck loaded with flour that was frozen solid in the ice by the bakery. The whole thing, including the cargo bed. On the 4th night, he lay on the roof and watched as the convoy men forced open the base gates and found empty shelves. You could hear Krieger screaming. A tall man in a coat made of sewn-together dogskins was slamming his scout's face against the hood and screaming that warehouses aren't supposed to be empty and stripped bare, and that a thief with impossible abilities was at work here. Aaron slithered off the roof with a nasty chill running down his spine. Krieger was a beast, but a clever one. On the 6th night, they were waiting for him. He realized it half a second before the crossbow clicked. He flinched, and the bolt pierced right through his left shoulder instead of his back. 4 men emerged from the rubble. Krieger had set up ambushes at all the key spots in the neighborhood, and one had worked. Aaron ran. His shoulder was on fire. Behind him, the snow crunched, and a second bolt fired, striking the wall next to his head and sending sparks flying. He darted through the entranceway and into the courtyard, realizing he was being hunted like game. Ahead, between the garages, 2 more men with rifles were waiting. And then he made a move that the whole of Hartholm would be discussing for a week. He didn't run away from the ambush. He ran straight into it. The shooter hesitated for a single breath because game doesn't behave that way. That split second was enough. Aaron crashed into him, and as he fell, drove the bullet into his chest and thought to himself, the man vanished. He simply vanished from the winter. The second thug stared at the empty spot where his partner had just been, and Aaron grabbed him by the collar with his bare hand in the same way. Then he stood in the darkness between the garages, listening as the trackers lost the trail, and realized that he had accidentally found a weapon more fearsome than a dagger. The two prisoners inside were bound and locked in the cellar under Holt's supervision. Aaron stitched up his shoulder with Ingrid's hands, and that very night he decided to end the war with a single blow. He could no longer afford to trade blows. The following night he went not to the warehouses but to the convoy's parking area by the water tower. He crawled the last 200 meters along the bed of a frozen stream. The sentries were looking out toward the approaches. No one was looking under the wheels of their own vehicles. Aaron crept up to the first tractor and placed his palm on the track. The tractor vanished. 40 metric tons of iron, fuel, and weapons turned into a ball as silently as an exhalation. The second tractor trailer vanished before the sentry on it could even turn to face the movement in the air. Aaron took the sentry along with the vehicle. Chaos broke out around the third vehicle. People were jumping out of their tents, shouting, and shining flashlights at the empty indentations in the snow. Krieger emerged from the tent, menacing yet calm. He was the only one not shouting. He slowly swept the barrel of his rifle through the darkness and spoke into the darkness, saying that he understood who he was dealing with, that the thief had nowhere to hide 3 vehicles and 30 people's worth of junk, that the thief had a hole where he hid everything, and that Krieger would find that hole and turn it inside out and live in it himself. Aaron listened from the darkness and took his piece away, piece by piece. The stack of jerry cans vanished. The supply tent vanished along with its frame. The third tractor trailer vanished. The convoy's men were breaking down before their very eyes. Staying out the night at -65 without vehicles or fuel meant certain death before dawn, and they all knew it. The scout with the battered face was the first to run. The rest followed in a rush. Krieger fired at their backs and roared something, but the winter night swallowed both the bullets and his voice. By morning, only one man remained by the water tower. He was sitting on a crate in the middle of the trampled, empty snow, holding his rifle on his lap. Aaron walked out to him in the open. Krieger raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. The firing pin clicked dryly. He'd run out of ammunition the night before. Aaron stopped 5 steps away and said he was offering a choice. Leave the city and head south on foot with a single backpack of food, or go to the same place as the cars. Krieger asked what was there where the cars were. Aaron answered honestly, warmth. Grass. The judgment of the people from whom Krieger had stolen a month of life. Krieger thought for a long time. Then he stood up, grabbed his backpack, and headed south without looking back. Aaron watched him go until he turned the corner. Holt later said it was a mistake, and that people like that always come back. Aaron replied that he knew, but there was no prison in Hartholm for a man like that, and he didn't want to become an executioner. They celebrated the victory for 2 days. There were now 38 people in the settlement, including the 7 surrendered convicts who, after a long debate, were accepted on probation under Holt's guarantee. There were vehicles, weapons, fuel, and enough food to last 2 months. The fields had grown to their full height. After all the nuclear warheads had been detonated during the war, the open space stretched so far that it took half an hour to walk from the lake to the far edge of the pine forest that had grown there. Aaron allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief, exactly 1 scene's worth of respite, as he later joked bitterly. Because on the 3rd night after the victory, strange things began to happen. Ingrid was the first to notice. She said that someone had moved her loaves in the oven from the left shelf to the right during the night, and the loaves had turned out better as a result. She suspected Martha, but Martha hadn't gone near the oven. Then Holt came in, looking gloomy, with his ledgers, and said the numbers didn't add up. There were 2 more sacks of grain in the barn than the records showed. Not fewer, more. In his 40 years, Holt had seen every kind of theft, but this was the first time he'd seen grain being stolen in the opposite direction. Then the children spoke of a tall figure. Tim and the two younger ones swore that at sunset, at the edge of the forest, someone slender and pale stood watching the village. But when you ran toward him, there was no one there and no footprints. The adults chalked it up to children's fears. But on the night of the 7th day after the victory, Aaron woke up to the silence. In Hearthhome, the lake was always noisy. Now it was silent. He stepped outside. The water in the lake lay as smooth as glass, without a single ripple. The air was still. Above the village, in the glassy sky, frost was slowly forming and taking shape into a pattern. Aaron looked up and felt a chill running down his spine, a frost that had never been felt inside the sphere. The pattern was precise and deliberate. Random ice doesn't form like that. He looked down and saw a trail of narrow footprints in the snow by the porch. The footprints began out of nowhere in the middle of the yard. They ran past his window and trailed off into nowhere. Aaron crouched over the tracks and ran his hand over them. A chill emanated from the imprints, that same biting cold that the creatures from outside brought with them. He straightened up and said into the still air that the owner of the tracks might come out, that hiding was foolish because there was nowhere to hide inside the sphere. The air above the lake quivered. Fog rose from the water's surface, and instead of dispersing, it gathered. It coalesced into a vertical figure, a tall one, slender, human in outline but not in proportion, a body of dense frost. Instead of a face, smooth ice in which a blue light swam, that very same light. Aaron had seen it hundreds of times in the chests of creatures on the tip of his harpoon. The figure walked toward him across the water, leaving no ripples. It stopped 3 steps away and spoke. The voice was like the creak of ice beneath a foot, but the words were clear. The creature said it had long studied how to form the sounds of this language by listening to people gathered around their stoves, that it was now ready to speak, and that, to begin with, it wanted to correct one mistake in Aaron's mind. Aaron asked which one. The creature replied that Aaron considered this land his own, but that was not true. It waved its hand, and the lake obediently rippled. It said it had remembered itself on the day Aaron drank the 100th core, that each core was not fuel, but a part, a fragment of something larger that had been whole before the cold began. Aaron had gathered the fragments in one place, and they had fused together. The space around it was neither a warehouse nor a shelter. It was a body, his body. Fields grew on his skin. The lake was his blood. The glass sky was his eyelid. And it asked whether the guest considered himself the master of the house or the house itself. Aaron stood there, thinking quickly. He felt fear, but his anger was stronger. He replied that he hadn't noticed the house hauling soil here in dump trucks on its own, or cutting its shoulder on bolts for every meter of this sky. The creature tilted its smooth head. It said that it valued the guest's hands. That was precisely why it was speaking rather than acting, and that it had a name. The people outside, calling it Frost, had come up with 100 names for it, but it had chosen one for itself from those it had heard by the stove. Scold. Then Scold demonstrated what the word act meant. It didn't move a muscle, it simply stopped holding back. The light over Hearthhome faded by twilight. The grass throughout the valley was covered in frost. Half-dressed people began to rush out of the houses, and their breath hung in the air as steam, something that had never happened inside before. And at the far end of the valley, where Aaron always entered and exited, the air was thick with a murky, icy film. Scold said flatly that the door was now closed, and it would open only when he deems necessary. Aaron rushed outward in his mind, just as he had done 1,000 times before, and he remained standing where he was. The teleportation didn't work. For the first time in all those months, the sphere had disobeyed him. A crowd was already gathering around him. Holt with a rifle, Martha with an axe. The former guards huddled together in a separate group. Tim looked at the white figure and said aloud, "There he is, the man from the forest." Scold bathed everyone in the blue light of his face and announced his terms. He did not wish for people to die. Dead people are boring, but the living bring something new inside, and he learns from them. People could stay, but they would live by his rules. He decides where to plant and when to harvest. He decides how much grain each person gets, because he's already figured out accounting better than the old man with his notebooks. He decides who comes in and who goes out, and the price for order will be growth. He pointed to a nearby garden bed, and before everyone's eyes, the bed swelled with greenery and, within a minute, yielded ripe fruit. A collective sigh swept through the crowd. Skoll said he could do this with every field, every day, that under his rule, no one would ever go hungry. And Aaron saw what he feared more than the locked door. He saw their faces. Ingrid was staring at the garden bed that had ripened in a minute, and her lips were trembling. Two guards exchanged glances and slowly nodded to each other. Even in the eyes of his own people, the temptation of well-fed slavery flashed for a single heartbeat. Holt broke the silence. He stepped forward with his notebooks and told the creaking creature that numbers are stubborn things, that the grain Skold makes grow in a minute does not draw its strength from thin air. Holt had spent 3 nights cross-checking his records. After each nightly miracle with the loaves and sacks, the space at the edges shrank by a dozen steps. Skold paid for the tricks with the body he called his own. The blue light in his icy face flickered, and Aaron realized that the old man had hit a sore spot. Skold acknowledged this calmly. Yes, his current strength is insufficient. 100 cores is a fragment of a fragment. For true power, more is needed. And then he turned to Aaron and said what he'd actually set out to discuss. Outside, winter is coming. Within winter, Skold feels it through the glass. Moving toward Norfolk through the ruins is what people would call the heart of the cold, the mother core, a piece of the primordial whole, the size of a house. Creatures from all corners of the realm are drawn to it like iron to a magnet. When it reaches the city, the temperature outside will drop to -120, and the tower, the ruins, and all living things within them will perish in a single night. Skoll proposed a deal. Aaron would go outside, lead the sphere to the mother core, and let it drink. Skoll would become whole. Then he would expand space to the horizon, give the people enough land to last them 10 lifetimes, and open the door forever. Aaron asked what would happen to all of them if Skold became whole. The creature paused. Then it replied that it honestly didn't know. It remembers itself as it is now. It doesn't remember itself as a whole. Perhaps, as a whole, it would be grateful. Perhaps, as a whole, it would no longer need people, just as it has no need for winter. Aaron asked what would happen if he refused. Skold's smooth face moved from Martha to Tim to Ingrid to the locked, murky door at the end of the valley. And he said, without a trace of threat in his voice, which only made it all the more terrifying, then they would stay and wait together, inside, under a closed sky, and they'll watch through the glass as the heart of cold kills the world outside. And then they'll find out if the glass is strong enough to withstand -120. He gave Arena until sunset. The figure dissolved into mist, and the mist was drawn into the lake. The light returned to the valley, and the grass sprang up as if nothing had happened. Only the door at the end of the valley remained murky and locked. The people were silent and looked at Arena, and outside, beyond the glass dome, far to the north of the ruins of Norfolk, at that very hour, a faint blue glow rose above the horizon and slowly moved toward the city. There were 6 hours left until sunset, judging by the light that Skold now turned on and off at his discretion. Arin gathered the council at Ingrid's house because her house was the farthest from the lake. Holt laid out the notebooks. Martha sat by the door with an an axe on her lap. They also summoned one of the former guards named Derek, because he had worked at the northern weather station until the cold set in and knew the ruins better than anyone. Arend started with the basics. Scold cannot be trusted in either scenario. The creature itself honestly admitted that it doesn't remember its whole self. So the deal is a game of dice with Winter. But refusal isn't a choice either. It's just a reprieve. The Mother Core will reach the city in a week, according to Derek's estimates, if the glow is moving at the same speed it was growing last night. Holt tapped his finger on the notebook and said the third thing everyone was afraid to say. Skull is lying or holding back information about the door. Holt ran the numbers. Every action the creature takes costs it space. Freezing the lake cost it space. The ripe vegetable patch cost it space. And the locked door costs it constantly. Since last night, the edges of the valley have closed in by 50 paces and continue to creep inward. Scold is keeping the door locked with his last ounce of strength and is urging Aaron on, not out of generosity, but out of weakness. The creature has spent almost everything it had on this display of power. Martha asked why they didn't simply wait until Scold was exhausted and the door opened on its own. Aaron replied that he had been watching the glow. You can't race against time. If Scold weakens in 10 days and the core arrives in 7, they'll open the door right at minus 120. A third way was needed, one that no one had suggested. And Aaron said that he thought he could see it. He spoke slowly, testing his idea as he went along. Scold was composed of cores. That meant Scold was neither a spirit nor a god, but a sum. And Aaron had worked with sums his entire life. In irrigation systems, when the pressure in the circuit rose above the calculated limit, no one prayed to the pipes. They'd install a bypass loop and discharge the excess into a separate tank. He looked at the sphere on his chest and asked aloud why everyone had decided there could only be one sphere. Derek was the first to understand and leaned forward. He said he'd seen the exact same souvenir at the weather station, a glass sphere on a stand in the boss's office. It had been sitting on the shelf for 20 years, and no one had touched it. Aaron nodded. He'd been thinking about that himself ever since that very first night. His sphere lay in the collection among hundreds of trinkets, but it was the only one that was warm. What if it wasn't the glass that made it warm, but the first core that had once, long ago, happened to be nearby? What if any vessel of the right shape became the same if fed light? Then the plan took shape as follows. Aaron convinces Scold that he has accepted the deal. Scold opens the door. Aaron goes outside, but not to the mother core. First, to the weather to get the second sphere. Here's the most delicate part. The new sphere must be fed with the cores of creatures so that it comes to life and begins to feed on its own. And then it must be brought to the mother core before Scold does. The excess will flow into the bypass circuit. Scold will be left with his 100 shards. And the power of the Heart of Cold will settle into a vessel that does not yet have a will of its own. Holt was silent for a long time, staring at his notebook. Then he said that the plan hinges on 3 ifs. If each if can kill. If the second sphere works at all. If Scold can't read minds. If Aaron can run all the way to the station through a city full of creatures swarming toward the core. Aaron replied that he was ready to hear the plan without the ifs. No one suggested otherwise, so they began to prepare it. They managed to get a lot done before sunset. Ingrid baked some bread for the journey. Darek sketched the route to the station on the board from memory, including 3 alternate routes. Marta selected the best warm clothing and a lightweight crossbow from the convoy's spoils. Holt took Aaron aside and said quietly that there was a 4th if that couldn't be spoken aloud. If the new sphere came to life and drank the Heart of Cold, then one day someone like Skoll would take shape within it as well. Aaron replied that he knew. But between a threat a year from now and death in a week, he'd choose a year. A year is time, and time is the only thing with which one can fight against winter. At sunset, Aaron went out to the lake alone. Fog rose from the water and coalesced into a figure before he even called out. Scold was waiting. Aaron said he agreed, that he would lead the orb to the mother's core, but he had conditions. conditions. The blue light in the icy face grew brighter, and Aaron took note of it. The creature had expected refusal and bargaining, and was pleased by the bargaining. The conditions were as follows. First, the door opens now and will never close again, no matter what happens outside. Second, while Aaron is outside, Scold will not use a single step of space for any miracles, because that space is the human's provisions in case of his death. Third, Scold will repeat in front of everyone that if he remains intact, he will not harm a single person inside. Scold was silent for a long time. Then he said that he accepts the first two conditions, and he will fulfill the third, but he honestly warns that he does not need the cost of this promise. The promise is made by his current self. The whole being will have to keep it. It was the most honest piece of treachery Aaron had ever heard in his life. He nodded. Scold waved his hand, and the murky film at the end of the valley melted away. The door opened. Aaron got ready in an hour. The entire population of Hearthholm had gathered on the shore. Tim slipped a wooden figurine of a wolf, which he'd carved himself, into Aaron's pocket, and said that the wolf wouldn't get cold. Martha checked the straps of his clothing silently and sternly, just as one checks a parachute. Holt simply shook his hand and held it a second longer than usual. Aaron stood at the teleportation point, looked back at the smoke rising above the rooftops, at the lake, at the forest, and committed it all to memory, just as one does before a parting. Then he stepped outside in his mind. The outside world struck him like a hammer. After months of living in the warmth, his body had grown unaccustomed to the cold. The frost seeped under every layer of his clothing within a minute. Norfall had changed. Hoarfrost lay a meter thick on the ruins. The sky to the north glowed with an even blue band, and the band was wider than yesterday. And the city was not empty. Aaron heard them before he saw them. Creatures were streaming along the avenues in all directions from him toward the north. Dozens, hundreds, small and large ones mingled, not looking at one another or at the man. They were drawn by the core, and everything else ceased to exist for them. Aaron stood in the shadow of the building's entrance and watched this river of ice. He would have to walk against the current along this river's course for 2 days. He adjusted his straps, pulled up his collar, and took his first step north. The first few hours were easier than he'd feared. The creatures marched toward the core as if on autopilot, and in their blind world, a human was nothing more than an obstacle not worth stopping for. Aaron moved through the courtyards parallel to their flow and tried not to cross the riverbed. He figured out the rule quickly. As long as you walk quietly and don't disturb their frost, they don't veer off course. Once, a small creature passed within 3 steps of him and didn't even turn its head. Aaron forbade himself from letting his guard down. The rules of winter always held true until the first exception. The exception occurred on the bridge across the frozen river. There was no other way north. The bridge was jammed with frozen-in cars, and the creatures were streaming across them in a continuous flow. Aaron waited in cover for an hour, looking for a gap. No gap appeared. Then he crawled under the bridge through a utility tunnel for cables. The tunnel was as narrow as a coffin. In the middle of the river, he heard a screech above his head. A large creature had stopped directly above him. Its icy breath trickled down through the grating of the deck, and Aaron felt his eyelashes freeze. He froze. He breathed shallowly and sparingly into his scarf. The creature swiveled its snout. It sensed something, but didn't understand what. Then a long howl from the north reached him from above, and the creature broke off and left. The call of the pack was stronger than that of prey. Aaron climbed onto the north bank with hands he had to warm in his armpit for 10 minutes before his fingers would bend. By nightfall, he had walked 20 kilometers and reached the outskirts. He couldn't spend the night out in the open. He chose a factory chimney with a cast iron door at the base, cleared the snow from inside, and spent the night in his sleeping bag, clutching the ball with both hands. The ball kept him warm. Through the glass, Aaron could vaguely see the sparks of Hart's Hill far below, beneath the curve of the tiny horizon, and the sight made him feel better. In the morning, he took a core for the first time on this expedition. A A small creature had strayed from the stream and was rummaging through the ruins of a bakery. Aaron took it down with his crossbow from 20 paces away, and the core was absorbed by the sphere almost instantly. He was no longer doing this for the sake of space. He was testing a hypothesis. If he could stockpile projectiles with his orb, perhaps he could later give them to the newcomer. The second day was worse. The stream of creatures was thickening. By noon, Aaron was counting them not in the hundreds, but in the thousands. The streams had merged into a continuous mass, and courtyards no longer offered refuge. For the last 10 kilometers to the station, he walked across rooftops. He jumped over gaps. He crawled along the ridges. Once the roof gave way beneath him, and he slid down the slope straight into the stream of creatures, managing to roll into a basement window half a second before a creature the size of a bus passed over the spot where he had fallen. In the basement, he waited it out, caught his breath, and admitted to himself that he was afraid, something he hadn't felt since the first creature on the staircase. The weather station stood on a hill above the city, a white tower with antenna spheres that, from a distance, looked like snow-covered souvenirs. The climb up the hill was clear. The creatures were skirting the hill from the side, which made Arena wary, but he had no choice. The station door turned out to be unlocked. Inside lay an untouched, frosty twilight. Derek had described the route exactly. Second floor, the chief's office, a shelf by the window. Aaron made his way over, stepping over scattered papers, and stopped at the office threshold. The shelf was in place. The dark wood stand was in place. The sphere was gone. A clean circle remained in the dust. Aaron stood there, staring at the circle and listening to the blood pounding in his temples. Someone had taken a souvenir. Recently, the dust around the circle had been disturbed, and a boot print was visible on the floor. Not an animal, a human. Aaron followed the tracks. They led down the hallway to the boiler room, and in the boiler room he saw a light, the faint, living glow of a fire. A man sat with his back to the door by the cast-iron stove, twirling a glass sphere in his hands. Aaron recognized him by the dogskin coat before the man even turned around. Krieger. The bandit turned around without haste. He wasn't carrying a rifle, but a cleaver lay on his lap. He looked at Aaron with a lingering gaze, laughed hoarsely, and said that Winter loves to play tricks. He told the story himself, without being asked. He hadn't made it south. The pass was completely snowed in. He turned back toward the city, and on the way he thought about the only mystery left in his life, the thief with the hole. For a month, Krieger had been thinking about where a man might hide a tractor. Then he remembered a pre-war tale told by meteorologists who used to drink at his bar and chat about the station chief and his toy, which felt warm to the touch in winter. Everyone had laughed back then. Now Krieger had come to check it out. He held the sphere up to the light of the hearth. Inside was a tiny beacon and snow, and the snow swirled on its own. Aaron asked quietly if Krieger had managed to do anything with it. Krieger answered honestly that he hadn't. It just keeps warm, that's all. The hole won't open. But Krieger is a patient man, and there's time until spring. He set his cleaver down comfortably and asked in turn why a man who already had a toy just like this, and one that worked, had come all the way through the city of death to get here. And Aaron made a decision he hadn't expected of himself. He told the truth, the whole truth, about the cores, about Hearthholm, about Scold, and the deal, and the mother core, and the plan with the bypass circuit. He spoke and watched the gangster's expression change. Krieger listened without interrupting. When Aaron finished, for a long time the only sound in the control room was the stove. Then Krieger said he understood two things. First, his sphere is dead because it didn't drink the light, and only someone who knows how to take the cores can revive it, and only Vosk knows how. Second, if Vosk dies on the way to the heart of cold, everyone will freeze to death, including Krieger, because minus 120 doesn't distinguish between the righteous and the guilty. He stood up. He handed Aaron the dead sphere, and he said that he wasn't offering friendship. There would never be friendship between them. and they both knew it. He was offering a pact between two people who shared a single enemy. Krieger knew the northern ruins down to the last cellar because he'd been looting them for half a year. He would lead Voss to the core by the shortest route, and the payment would be a place in the warmth. Not mercy, not forgiveness. A place under the terms of the pact, subject to the community's judgment, just as for his former men. Aaron stared at the outstretched sphere. Holt would have said this was a mistake and that people like that never change. Holt would probably have been right, but outside, the 100,000th winter was howling, and it was a 2-day journey to the blue glow, through lands where Aaron knew nothing and Krieger knew everything. Aaron took the sphere from his hands, and he said that the deal was accepted, but at the first stab in the back, Krieger would be sent inside the sphere, straight into the hands of those he had robbed. Krieger bared his teeth and replied that he hadn't expected anything else. That very night, by the light of the stove, Aaron conducted his first experiment. He took 3 bullets from a small bag, ones he'd picked up along the way, and held them up to the dead sphere. The bullets didn't budge. The sphere didn't react. Aaron tried this way and that. He pressed them against it. He held them close for hours. Nothing. Krieger watched in silence. Then Aaron took his living sphere in his left hand and the dead one in his right, brought them right up against each other, and thought about the overflow just as he had thought about the transfer. The living sphere twitched. Inside it, at the far edge of the valley, a flash of light flared up. Some of the light flowed out through his palms, through his chest, through his right hand. The dead sphere flickered, once, twice, and the snow inside it swayed and slowly drifted in a circle. Aaron sat between the 2 living spheres and felt like a bridge. And far below in Hearthholm, at that very moment, Skold lifted his smooth face from the lake and looked up through the glassy sky, because he felt as though a part of his body had just been taken away. In the morning, the 2 of them went out together, and Aaron quickly realized he'd made the right choice. Krieger led the way through the ruins as naturally as water flows through a riverbed. He knew which basements were connected. He knew where the heating pipes lay beneath the snow, pipes along which one could travel a kilometer without having to go above ground. He knew the creatures' habits just as well as Aaron did, because he, too, had survived among them for half a year, only without a warm orb tucked under his arm. By noon, they had accomplished as much as Aaron could do in a single day on his own. During a rest stop in the former boiler room, Aaron set to work on the second orb. The sphere came to life, but was weak. The space inside could barely fit a hand. Aaron held out a core from the pouch toward it, and now it took it, greedily, like parched earth taking in water. The space inside expanded. The rule was confirmed. A vessel that has come to life feeds itself. That means along the way, he must feed it every core he encounters, so that by the time it meets the heart of the cold, it will be as deep as possible. Krieger watched and asked the question that Aaron himself was afraid to ask. He asked whether a second Skold would eventually form in the new realm. Aaron answered as he had answered Holt. It will. Probably. But they'll have time to prepare, and they'll have knowledge they didn't have the first time. Krieger snorted and said that people always say that when they bring a beast into the world they can't feed. There was nothing to argue about. They walked and hunted. Krieger turned out to be a formidable hunter. He didn't like taking risks, so he killed with precision. He lured lone creatures with bait made of rags soaked in diesel fuel residue, because the beasts would follow any trace of heat. He struck from ambush, aiming the first blow at the core. By the evening of the second day of their journey together, the small bag was empty, and the second sphere had consumed 11 cores, and was now large enough to hold a small room. During rest stops, Aaron would transfer small items into it, food supplies, fuel. It was sensible, and yet it troubled him. He caught himself becoming attached to the second sphere as if it were his own. Meanwhile, his own sphere was changing. Aaron could feel it with his palms. Hearthholm's sphere had become restless. Something was happening inside it, and on the third night, Aaron decided to take a look. He didn't teleport himself there so as not to waste time. He simply peered through the glass, just as he had on the first day. The valley was intact, the lights were on, but above the lake stood a pillar of fog taller than the pine trees, and the fog was slowly swirling. Skold wasn't wasting space. He was keeping his end of the bargain. He was doing something else. He was gathering himself into a dense mass. He was preparing, like a beast preparing to pounce after being promised a meal. On the morning of the fourth day, they saw the core with their own eyes. They climbed to the crest of the railroad embankment, and Krieger silently pointed north. Across the plain beyond the city, a mountain of blue light was moving. It wasn't the size of a house, as Skold had said. It was the size of a cathedral. Its light didn't sting the eyes, but weighed heavily upon them. It made their teeth ache and their thoughts grow muddled at the edge of consciousness. Living ice flowed for kilometers around the mountain. Thousands of creatures moved in circles alongside the core, like satellites orbiting a planet. The snow in front of the mountain evaporated without melting. The air behind it froze into a glassy crust. Krieger stared at it for a long time, then said flatly that they'd have to change their plans. They couldn't get close to it. Any one of them would freeze to death 100 steps short of the target, despite the heat spheres. He'd spotted an abandoned water pump yesterday, right in the path of the core. If we took up position on its upper platform, the mountain would pass by at a distance of 30 paces. 30 paces is still death, but not instantaneous. Maybe Vosk will have 10 seconds to focus on drinking it before the cold stops his heart. Aaron stared at the mountain of light and said nothing. 10 seconds. He remembered drinking the core of the pack leader. Back then, the light flowed into the sphere for several seconds, and the core was the size of a child's head. There was work to be done here that would take minutes. Minutes he wouldn't have. He said this out loud. Krieger shrugged and replied that in that case, they'd need someone who could last longer than a human. Both fell silent because they were both thinking the same thing. Skold. A creature of ice for whom the frost is home. Skold could stand by the core for as long as necessary, but releasing Skold out into the heart of the cold meant giving him everything they were after. They spent the night at the water pump. According to Krieger's estimates, the mountain was supposed to level with it by the following noon. Aaron didn't sleep. He sat on the platform between the two spheres and thought more intensely than he ever had before. The plan with the bypass circuit had fallen apart. The second sphere had held only a room during their entire journey, but it needed to hold a cathedral. It was physically incapable of absorbing the mother core faster than Skolda, even if Aaron had survived at its base. He ran through the options, and each one hit a dead end. And then an image surfaced from his own past life, an emergency vent at the fourth complex. When the pressure surged and the relief tank couldn't handle it, the engineers did something forbidden. They connected the circuits in a cascade. They routed the excess through the small tank directly into the large one, and the pipe itself held up because the flow didn't linger inside it, but passed right through. Aaron looked at the small sphere, then at his own, then at his reflection in the glass. A bridge. He was already a bridge when he channeled light from sphere to sphere through his own body. What if he didn't absorb the core of either sphere? What if he let it pass right through? Through the small sphere as through a neck, through himself as through a pipe, and pour it into a place where space is almost infinite, and where there is someone to receive and hold that flow. Into Hearthholm, to Skold, to give Skold power, but not the way Skold wanted, not to let him drink the core himself, free from the outside, but to pour it into him inside the sphere, where he is locked within the body of the valley and bound by people and these conditions. Aaron cut off his train of thought at a foreign word that had slipped out of weariness and began again, slowly. Skold will receive the power of the whole, but he will receive it as part of the world that people have built. A world where Hearthholm stands, where Holt lives with his notebooks, where Ingrid's bread grows. There is a difference between a beast raised in the forest and a beast raised by the hearth. The stakes were monstrous. Aaron understood this. He was going to create a god and hope that a god raised among people would not be in vain. In the morning, he laid out the plan to Krager. Krager listened, spat down from the water tower, and said he'd never heard a worse plan in his entire life. Then he added that there were no other plans and asked what he was supposed to do. Aaron replied that Krager would have the simplest job. If Aaron died in the middle of the overflow, Krager was to grab both spheres and run south without looking back. Down below, beneath the embankment, the earth was already trembling. The mountain of light was entering the city. There were 4 hours left until noon. Aren took his sphere, peered inside, and called out. The fog over the lake stirred. Skoll heard him. The most important conversation of his life lay ahead, and it had to be conducted through the glass, 2 days' journey away, via whispered thoughts. Aren took a deep breath and began. Communication through the glass proved possible. As soon as Aren focused on the figure by the lake, the words flowed as naturally as thoughts do. Skoll's reply sounded inside his head like the creak of a rusty hinge. Aren laid everything out honestly, because the creature understood lies better than humans did. He said that Skoll wouldn't be able to drink the core from the outside without breaking the deal regarding the door and space, and that Aren himself, at the foot of the mountain, would die before he finished. That left the cascade. The power of the whole would enter Skoll, but it would enter home, into a body that had already fused with the fields, the lake, and the people. Skoll was silent for a long time. Then he asked why Aren was warning him instead of acting in secret. Aaron replied that the conduit can withstand the flow only if both ends are ready. If, at the moment of the overflow, Skoll becomes frightened or starts drawing the power himself, it will tear Aaron apart and flood the valley with frost. He doesn't need permission. He needs a second engineer at the other end of the circuit. Skoll made a sound Aaron had never heard from him before, a short crackle, like laughter. The creature said that, for the first time in all their conversations, a human had offered him not a deal, but a job, and that this changed more than the human realized. Then Skoll asked one last question. He asked if Aaron understood that, if he were whole, he could kill everyone right away, and that Aaron wasn't risking his own life, but the lives of others. Aaron replied that he understood, and that he wasn't betting blindly. He had seen how Skoll had rearranged Ingrid's loaves so they would bake better. A creature curious about bread is no longer quite in winter. The silence in his head lasted so long that Aaron had time to get scared. Then Skoll said one word, ready. After that, there was work, and work saved him from fear. Krager secured Aaron to the water pump platform with backpack straps, so his body wouldn't be blown away or thrown off by a spasm. They tied the small sphere to his left palm with wire, the large one to his right over his gaiter. Krager climbed down to the lower level behind the concrete parapet, and from there he was supposed to watch, and the ground was already shaking continuously. Light was spreading through the streets like a slow flood. The creatures flowed below, right beneath the water pump, like a solid river, and their chill rose upward in waves. Aaron breathed through his scarf and counted his breaths. On the count of 200, the mountain came into view at the end of the street. Up close, it was impossible to take in with the eyes. His gaze slipped away. His brain refused to acknowledge that something like this could move. Blue light filled everything, and in that light, all sound died. Aaron could no longer even hear his own heartbeat. The frost grew. 50 steps. 40. The glass on the watch face on his wrist shattered. 30. Frost crept along his eyelashes from inside his eyelids. Aaron raised his left hand, holding the small sphere toward the mountain, and his right hand, holding the large one, south toward the house, and did what he had done 1,000 times with the creature's cores. He pulled. The world turned white, then blue, then vanished. Only 3 points remained: the mountain, him, and the valley. And between them, it surged. It couldn't be called pain, because pain has an end, but this had no end. Light entered the small sphere, and the sphere screeched like glass on a single note. It passed through it into his palm, down his arm, across his chest, where it was neither cold nor hot, but simply unlike anything he'd ever experienced. And it flowed into his right palm, forming a large sphere. Aaron held it. He was a conduit, and the conduit held it. Seconds stretched into hours. He could feel the far end of the circuit. He felt Skold standing in the center of the valley, his arms outstretched from the frost, receiving the flow and weaving it into the lake, into the fields, into the roots of the pines, distributing the power throughout the body of the world, just as Aaron had once distributed water throughout the sections. The second engineer was at work. Halfway through the overflow, something terrible began. The mountain sensed that it was being drained. A spasm ran through the river of creatures below, and thousands of snouts turned upward toward the water pump. The creatures scrambled up the supports. Through the howl of light, Aaron heard the rumbling below and couldn't even turn his head. And then, piercing through the roar, came a sound he hadn't expected: gunshots. Krieger hadn't run away. The bandit stood on the lower level by the stairs, firing his rifle point blank at the climbing creatures and yelling at them the way one yells at a clear enemy. He took down 4 of them. The 5th one swept the parapet away along with him. Aaron felt a man below let out a short scream, and everything inside him surged toward that sound. But his body remained strapped in, and the current wouldn't let him go. He held on. He wept from helplessness, ice forming on his cheeks, and he held on. The light was fading. The mountain dimmed, sank, and lost its shape. A final surge of strength coursed through Aaron with such force that the straps snapped and the world returned. Sound, a gray sky, snow, silence. Aaron lay on the landing and looked up. The mountain was gone. Where it had passed, a glass furrow stretched across the entire city. The creatures below stood motionless. Then the one closest to him settled into a pile of ordinary ice. Behind it, a second one. A wave of disintegration rolled across the river of dead ice all the way to the horizon. Without the heart of the cold, they could not live. Aaron slid down the stairs to the lower level. Krieger lay by the broken railing with his leg twisted unnaturally, and he was alive. The creature had died after crushing his thigh before it could finish him off. He looked at Aaron with cloudy eyes and asked if it had worked. Aaron replied that it had, and that Krieger was an idiot who'd been told to run. Krieger bared his teeth through his broken mouth and said that running away was boring. Aaron teleported him inside the sphere, right there onto the snow on the outskirts of Hearthholm, and shouted telepathically for them to come get the wounded man. And then he himself sat down on the bottom step of the water pump, facing south, and allowed himself a minute not to be a pipe or a bridge, but to be just a very tired person. He teleported back inside once he'd caught his breath, and froze at the spot where he'd teleported. The valley had changed. The sky above Hearthholm had become higher and deeper, and for the first time, real clouds were drifting across it. Beyond the far wall of the forest, where a white mist had once hung at the border, hills now stretched into the distance. Green hills stretching all the way to the horizon, which hadn't been there before. The lake had grown into a small sea with islands. The air smelled of a thunderstorm and a blooming meadow all at once. Space had expanded not by a factor of a few, but by orders of magnitude. Everyone was waiting for him by the lake. People stood in a semicircle, silent, gazing over his shoulder. Aaron turned around. Skold was walking across the water toward the shore, unharmed. He had grown taller, and his frost-covered body now held more than just winter. Patterns of frost were sliding down his shoulders and melting, revealing beneath them something resembling bark, stone, and living flesh. The light in his face was no longer a piercing blue, but as deep as the evening sky. Skold stopped in front of Aaron. The valley fell silent. Holt clutched his notebooks. Marta placed her hand on her axe, and Skold slowly bowed his head. He did not nod. He bowed. He said that he now remembers everything. He remembers himself as whole before the split. He remembers how he was the entire land in winter, and how he was shattered by those who feared his power in a war that people have already forgotten. He remembers other things as well. He remembers Ingrid's bread. He remembers Holt's numbers. He remembers the man who became a pipe and entrusted him with the far end of the circuit. As a whole, he could have wiped out the valley with a single breath. But as a whole, he had grown from 100 days lived among people, and those 100 days now weighed heavier within him than 1,000 years of winter. He raised his hand, and high above the valley, in the new sky, a small, warm sun lit up. Skold said that out there, the world remained dead and cold, because the heart of the cold was not the only one. At the edge of the world, there are others. But that is a concern for the future, and today, he offers people something he has never offered to anyone before. Not the order of a master, a union, his strength and their hands. And the first shared home on this earth already stands. He gestured toward Hearthholm, and the sound of bells rang out over the village, even though there had never been a bell there. The people stood there, stunned, and Aaron looked at the new sun and realized that the hardest part was not behind him. The hardest part was just beginning, because living alongside a god turned out to be a more complicated task than creating him. The first month of the alliance was later called the month of 3 mistakes, and none of the 3 were made by Skold. The first was made by the people. After the sun and the hills stretching to the horizon appeared, something began in Hearthholm that Holt dryly referred to in his notebooks as dizziness. There was almost no need to work anymore. At the very first request, Skold grew crops, built houses, and deepened the wells. People came to him for everything. Even Ingrid once asked him to stoke the stove without firewood, and he did it. She only felt ashamed afterward. 2 weeks later, Holt laid out the figures before Aaron. The community's output had fallen by a factor of 4. In a single month, people had forgotten what they'd spent the entire winter learning. The community was turning into a flower bed, for God's sake. Aaron went to the lake to talk. Skold listened and replied unexpectedly. He said that he saw it himself and that he disliked it just as much. He was simply bored with being a wish-granting servant. Winter is no servant. He just didn't know how to refuse without causing fear. They agreed on a rule, which was later carved into a stone by the lake. Skold does what people cannot do. The weather, the borders, great waters, whatever people are capable of, they do themselves. The very first refusal under the new rule caused resentment, and 3 families demonstratively put down their tools. Skold didn't flinch. After a week of hungry pride, the tools were picked up again, work resumed, and with it, something important returned to their faces. Aaron made the second mistake. He delayed the trial of Krieger. The bandit, whose leg had been set by Skoll, was already walking with a cane, and his presence lingered in the settlement like yeast. 7 former convoy members stuck close to him. The families of those harmed by the convoy glared at him like wolves. Aaron kept putting it off because he owed Krieger his life and didn't know how to weigh that. It came to a fight. That evening, by the barn, the son of a man killed during the old man's raid lunged at Krieger with a pitchfork, and Krieger knocked the pitchfork out of his hand with a stick. He could have killed him, but didn't. A trial was convened the next day. The entire community judged the case, as agreed. The charges against Krieger were grave. 8 lives lost in the neighborhood over the months of the convoy. Offsetting these charges were a broken water pump, 4 dead animals, and a crushed leg. They argued until nightfall. They asked Skold to adjudicate, but Skold refused, saying that the judgment of a man belongs to the people, and that was perhaps his wisest refusal. The verdict was as follows. Krager does not forfeit his life for the lives he saved because he shielded everyone with his own body, but for 10 years he works for the community without the right to vote and without a weapon, and every family that has lost loved ones has the right to summon him to the grave at any time, and he is obligated to come and stand there. Krager listened while standing. He said one word, accepted. And from that day on, he worked so hard that within a year, he was the first to be called upon for any hard labor. And after 2 years, his voting rights were restored early, but that came later. No one made the third mistake. It came of its own accord. At the end of the month, Skold asked to meet for the first time on his own initiative, and that in itself was an event. He waited for Arena not by the lake, but on the distant hills at the very edge of the world. He looked unusual. The light on his face was subdued. Skold said he had something to show her. He placed his palm against the white wall of the border, and the wall became transparent, like a window. Beyond it was neither Arena's room nor the ruins of Norful. Beyond it was the sky outside the planet, and in that sky, far to the north of the world, points of light were burning, 7 blue points. Skold said that now that he was whole, he could feel them constantly. 7 other hearts, 7 shards of the same ancient winter as himself. For now they slept scattered at the edge of the world, but the gurgling at the water pump sounded to them like a cry in a silent room. 2 of them are already on the move, slowly. Years of travel, but they're moving this way, because they sensed their brother, who had become whole and had become different. Winter tolerates no traitors. Arin asked how much time they had. Skoll replied that the first heart would reach Norful in 3 years, according to his sense of time. And he added something that sent a genuine chill down Arin's spine. Each of the 7 is no weaker than the one Arin had poured out, and some are older and deeper. And Skold alone cannot stand against them, because he is now half summer, while they are whole winter. They stood on the hill and were silent. Below lay the valley. Hearthholm's chimneys were smoking. The first boat built by humans was sailing across the new sea. Tim was teaching the younger ones to swim near the islands. All of this had to be prepared in time for the war within 3 years. Arin asked what needed to be done, and Skoll replied with a word that Arin himself had once said to him: work. They need more space because space is Skoll's power. That means they need cores, and the only cores left are in the distant, dead cities on the edge of the land. They need more people because wherever in the ruins of the continent, communities of survivors still live, and every person saved is a pair of hands. And because, as Skold admitted almost sheepishly, every living person within him makes him stronger in a way he himself does not understand. The warmth of people was to him the same as the cores, and they needed a second sphere. Arin shuddered. The small sphere that had survived the flood hung on his chest next to the first. He had been thinking about it all these weeks and had said nothing. Skold said he sensed depth within it. The cascade had washed it with the power of a whole heart, and now it was no longer a room. It was a valley no smaller than this one had been before the flood. Empty, warm, waiting. A second world into which people could be led if the first were to fall, or which could be raised as a second bastion. But the second sphere would also have a second inhabitant, sooner or later. Skold said this, looking directly into Arin's eyes with the light of his face. A knot is already forming within her, not yet a conscious one. For now, it's simply the light's habit of coalescing into a whole. Who he becomes depends on what grows around him as he takes shape. Skold took shape amid bread and notebooks, and that is why he became who he became. Aaron asked what Skold advised, and the being replied that he advised not to hide the sphere, but to populate it immediately with people who have warm hands, and to appoint a guardian for it who would live within it and nurture it from the inside. Down in the valley, a bell rang, summoning the community to dinner. Aaron stood on the hill, holding in the palm of his hand a small sphere, inside which lay an empty, warm valley and its future, unknown god. 3 years until the first winter from the north. 7 hearts. 2 worlds around his neck. He remembered how, on the 47th day of the cold, he'd searched for a can of stew to last 5 days, and he smiled. Then he walked down toward the bell. Plans of this magnitude should be discussed around a common table. His former life had taught him that. Winter had taught him that. And, as it turned out, even a god could be taught that in a single month of the alliance. That evening, around the communal table, Aaron laid everything out. 7 hearts, 3 years, the second sphere, with its empty valley and future inhabitant. He spoke and looked at their faces, and their expressions shifted from fear to weariness, and from weariness to stubbornness. These people had already survived the end of the world once. A second end of the world angered them rather than frightened them. Holt was the first to speak. He said that 3 years wasn't a death sentence, but a deadline for completing the work, and that he proposed dividing the work into 4 areas. Cores, people. The second area, defense. Each required a person in charge, and so a council of 4 was formed in Hearthholm. Aaron took charge of the cores because he was the only one who knew how to handle them. Martha took charge of the people because she herself had come in from the cold and knew how to speak to those who had stayed behind. After a brief debate, defense was assigned to Derek, given his knowledge of the north and his maps. As for the second area, the question of a guardian arose, and the matter remained unresolved. Living inside the small world permanently meant leaving this one behind. It meant cultivating an empty valley from scratch. And most importantly, it meant being close to the one who would one day awaken there and becoming for him what Ingrid's bread had become for Skold. No volunteers came forward that evening. One was found the next morning. Ingrid came to Aaron. The old woman placed a bundle of belongings and a pot of bread starter on the table and said that she had done her part in this world, but in the other world there was no end to the work, and that if a future god was to be raised by the hearth, there was no better hearth for it than hers. Aaron looked at her and understood that she was right, for only old age is ever right. A day later, Ingrid moved into the small sphere as its first inhabitant. 2 young families and an old carpenter asked to follow her. They named the small valley Quiet. According to the agreement, Skold transferred part of his power into it, the first sun and the first water, and said he could give no more. Quiet must grow through its own efforts, otherwise its inhabitant would become spoiled. Then time flew by as construction began. The first year, Aaron and Darek traveled in caravans through the dead cities of the region. The convoy's tractor trucks hauled them across hundreds of frozen kilometers. In every city, Aaron drank the cores of solitary creatures that had survived without hearts, and the valley at home grew. In every city, Marta searched for the living. They found a community of 70 people in Westfall's underground garage. They found 30 people at the cannery. They found others as well. Not everyone came along. The elder of one community called the sphere a devil's trap and led his people into the blizzard. And Martha didn't speak to anyone for a week, but most came along. By the end of the first year, 400 people lived in Hearthholm and the 3 new settlements that had sprung up around it. The second year, Skold taught the people and learned himself. He built what he called the hardening ground on the northern border of the valley, a strip of cold where volunteers trained to move and work in the frost, under the watchful eye of one who was Frost himself. Derek formed these people into squads. Skoll, meanwhile, made the war's most important discovery. He realized he could exhale a part of himself outward through Aaron, as if through a pipe, not for long, for hours at a time. Frosty copies of himself, as tall as a house, fought on the outside, while Aaron held the perimeter from within. The rehearsals wore Aaron out to the point of fainting, but by the end of the second year, they were able to hold the perimeter for 6 hours. Meanwhile, in Tikaya, the fields and streets had risen, and in the evenings, children gathered by Ingrid's stove to listen to fairy tales. And in the air above Tikaya, something was already listening along with them from time to time. Formless for now, just attention for now. Ingrid spoke aloud to this attention as if to a grandson, and was not afraid. The third year began on a bad note. Derek's sentries in the outer watchtowers spotted a glow a month earlier than expected. The first heart was moving faster than Skold sensed, and it wasn't alone. The two moving hearts joined forces. 2 mountains of light crept toward Northfall a week apart, and trailing behind them were new rivers of creatures born around them along the way. The Council of 4 gathered that night. Derek reported the situation. It was impossible to confront both hearts at once. The cascade overflow required Aaron to rest for a day afterward, and a week between the hearts might not be enough if the second one sped up. That meant the first one must not be consumed, but killed in the field, wasted, forced to burn itself out, and only the second one should be consumed. Skold added a cold detail. A heart can only be killed by forcing it to expend its power faster than it can replenish it. That is, by presenting it with targets, many targets, living ones. A long silence hung over the table. Then Krieger asked to speak from the floor without the right to vote, and said that the targets didn't have to be stupid. For half a year, he'd led a convoy through the traps of this region, and knew how to make the enemy strike at nothing. Let the heart burn through its power on tractor trailers, on remote-controlled cables, on dummies doused in hot oil, on heat pipeline explosions, on everything that's hot and is not alive. Derek silently slid a map toward him. By dawn, the plan was set. They called it the 100 Bonfires Plan. All winter long, until the first heart approached, the community had been preparing a field of death on the northern plain. 100 points of heat, buried tow trucks, barrels of leftover fuel, pumps pumping hot water from a drilled well through pipes buried under the snow so that the plain would breathe warmth as if it were alive. Skoll walked across the future battlefield in the body of a frost-covered giant, memorizing every meter. And in the final week before the approach, something happened that no one had expected. That night, Arena woke Martha and led her to the small sphere he had left overnight in the council house. The sphere was glowing. Inside, above the roof of Ingrid's house, stood a pillar of soft, golden light, slowly rotating. Aren was transported inside. Ingrid sat on the porch, calm and solemn, holding a pot of sourdough starter on her lap. She said it had spoken an hour ago, its first word, and the word was bread. Above the chimney of her house, the light coalesced into a small figure, not made of ice, made of a warm, golden haze like the air above a summer road. The figure turned toward Aren and said, in a voice like the crackling of a fire in the stove, that it knew him. Grandmother told me, "You are the one who wears it around your neck at home." Aaron stood in the middle of Tikaya and gazed at the newborn creature formed of light by the stove, amidst the fairy tales. And the creature looked at him with a child's curiosity. Outside, in the big world, there were 9 days left until the first full winter set in. Ingrid named the newborn. She said that since Skoll had taken his name from something overheard by the stoves, this one's name should be a hearth name, and she named him Teppel. The name was funny and homely, and it stuck instantly. Teppel grew not by the day, but by the hour, yet he grew strangely. His strength was still as thin as a candle flame, but his curiosity was boundless. He'd tag along with the carpenter and watch as he planed a board. He'd sit like a mirage at the edge of the field and watch the harvest. 9 days before the battle, Aaron convened a council right in Tikaya to resolve the main issue. Skold asked that Teppel be brought to him, to get acquainted. Holt was vehemently opposed. He said that bringing a newborn god together with a fully grown god was like putting a wolf cub with an adult wolf, and not even 100 days by the hearth could guarantee anything. Ingrid replied that fear was a poor teacher, and that if Tepla were hidden from the powerful from birth, he would grow up to be either a coward or a jealous person. Aron decided to take the risk. Tepla was transported to a large valley within the sphere that Aron held in his palms. Skold was waiting by the lake. The frost giant and the golden mirage the size of a cat stared at each other for a long time. Then Tepla asked first. He asked if it were true that Skold had once been the winter that killed people. Everyone froze. Skold answered yes. Tepla thought for a moment and asked why it had stopped. Skold replied that he had been transformed by bread, numbers, and one stubborn man. Tepla turned to Aron and said matter-of-factly that everything was clear now, and asked him to show him the numbers. From that day on, Holt gained the strangest student of his life. The golden mirage hovered over his notebooks for hours, keeping the accounting. And Skold told Aron in private that he was now at peace. A being who, first and foremost, asks why rather than how much can be grown. Winter set the date for the battle. At dawn on the 9th day, the northern horizon burst into flames. The first heart emerged onto the plain of 100 bonfires. It was smaller than the one Aron had poured at the water pump, but it moved in a ring of thousands of creatures, and the frost rolled before it like a wall. According to the plan, the community retreated deep into the sphere. Only Aron remained outside, in the concrete communications bunker, maintaining the circuit. Skold, a giant on the plain, and Derek with Krieger and 20 men, hardened on the far frontiers, manning the levers and cables. The first few hours went like clockwork. His heart pounded with warmth. The fires flared up one after another, drawing strands of power from him. The cable-driven tractors crept along and died under the frost's blows, dragging the creatures away. Skold fought on the left flank, retreating in a measured and calculated arc that he and Derek had been tracing all winter. The heart was expending its energy. By noon, its light had noticeably dimmed, and Aron, in the bunker, allowed himself a sip of water. And then winter showed that it too could learn. The heart stopped in the middle of the field. It stopped beating over the bonfires, and it began to freeze the ground beneath itself in a circle, a well. It had sensed the well with hot water that fed the entire field, and was now gushing into a single point deep underground. Pipes burst under the snow, one after another. The field of fires was dying. Derek shouted into the radio from the front line that if the heart silenced the well, it would press on with full force. The decision had to be made in seconds, and Krieger made it. His voice over the radio said that we had one more hotspot, the biggest one, and named the square. Aron looked at the map, understood, and felt a chill run down his spine. Krieger was driving out his tractor-trailer, the only one still running, with a full tank, a hot engine still alive, bait the heart wouldn't be able to resist. The tractor-trailer pulled out of the ravine and headed across the plain, cutting straight through it. My heart followed suit. It tore itself away from the well. Krieger drove the truck in a zigzag across the dead field, and the frost lashed at him, missing by meters, and every miss cost my heart strength. He squeezed 20 minutes out of that chase. On the 21st minute, a beam of light engulfed the tractor entirely. The radio fell silent, and the heart, frozen above the burned-out vehicle, suddenly flickered. Once, twice. It was empty. Skold struck from the flank with all he had left. The giant stepped into the dim light, clung to the core up to his waist, and didn't drink. He crushed it. The explosion took them both down. The light of the heart scattered across the plain in stray shards and faded into the snow. Skold's frost-covered body crumbled beside it. Aron, in the bunker, screamed into the circuit and heard a distant creak. Alive. Skold pulled himself home through the pipe, thin to a thread but intact. Victory stood on the plain amid black skeletons and dead ice. Derek was the first to reach the burned-out tractor. Krieger was found 10 paces from the vehicle. He'd managed to jump out, and the frost had caught up with him mid-leap. He lay there like an icy statue, facing north toward the enemy. They carried him inside and buried him on the hill above the lake. And on the stone they carved not 10 years without the right to vote, but 2 words. He kept his word. The entire community stood by the grave, including the families who had once called on him to stand over other graves. The silence was honest. This man never became a good man. He became reliable, and at the end of the world, that turned out to be more valuable. They gave him no rest. The night after the funeral, Scold, weaker than ever, told Irina the most important thing. The second heart saw everything, through his creatures, through the cold itself. It saw the field of campfires and bait and the giant, and it changed course. It no longer headed toward Norfall across the plain. It turned toward the mountains and now moved along the ridge, where no wells could be drilled and no bonfires set, and it picked up speed. Derek spread out the map and traced his finger along the ridge. His finger stopped at the point where the mountain road led to the city, the pass. The very same pass that Krieger had once been unable to escape through, a narrow gorge in the rocks, the only place where the heart could be intercepted before it emerged into the open. Skoll looked at the map and said quietly that he wouldn't be able to fight in the rocks. There was nowhere for the giant to stand there. At the pass, everything would come down to a single cascade, to the pipe, to Aren. And after the first battle, both of them had less than half their strength left. And there were 4 days left until the pass. 4 days shrank into one long, sleepless day. The plan for the pass was terrifyingly simple. In the narrow gorge between the cliffs, the heart would pass 40 paces from an old road tunnel hewn into the rock. Aren would stand in the tunnel with both spheres and channel the cascade like a water pump. Skold would receive it at the far end. Everything was just like back then, except for 3 things. Back then, Aaron was unharmed, but now, after the battle, his hands were trembling from an hour of maintaining the circuit. Back then, the heart knew nothing, but now it knew everything, and was heading out to destroy the pipe itself. And back then, there weren't 400 people standing below, with nowhere to run if the pipe burst. On the second day of preparations, Holt arrived, bringing not notebooks, but an idea. He said he'd been thinking constantly about Skold's words, that the living people inside made him stronger in some inexplicable way. The warmth of people is like a core. If that's true, then Skold's strength down there is now at its lowest, not just because of his wounds. The community had lived in fear for a month, and fear is cold. Holt proposed something foolish from a wartime perspective: to halt all work except what was essential for 2 days, and hold a celebration inside, a real one, with bread, music, and silliness, to warm the god. Derek called it madness. Aaron called it reserve fuel, and scheduled the celebration for the eve of the battle. And on the 3rd day, Teppel made his presence known. He appeared at the council himself as a golden mirage, already the size of a dog, and declared that he had done the math. He was now good at math. He said that based on Holt's figures and what he sensed within his sphere, this was the conclusion. Over the past 3 years, Tikaya had grown and strengthened, and her space retained heat on its own. This meant that during the battle, Teppel could do what Skold, bound to the Great Valley, could not. Teppel could step entirely into the small sphere. In other words, the sphere with him inside could hang on Aaron's chest in the gallery, and Teppel would warm Aaron through the glass from inside while he holds the cascade. A little stove for the pipe. The council remained silent. Then Skold said that it would work, and that he hadn't suggested it himself because he didn't have the right to do so. The risk was obvious to everyone. If Aaron died in the gallery, both spheres would be left lying in the snow next to the solid winter. Ingrid was asked to talk her ward out of it. Ingrid came, listened, and said she wouldn't try to dissuade him, that she hadn't raised him so he could tend the stove in a safe place while his family stood out in the cold. She said the word family calmly, and everyone heard it. The celebration the day before had been a success, against all odds. The community seemed to exhale its fear all at once. They were baking in the square. The carpenter played a homemade violin. The children rolled tepla like a golden ball, and he laughed amid the crackling of the logs. Skold stood above the square, not participating, but soaking it all in. And by midnight, Aaron saw for the first time in a week that the light in his face was burning to its fullest depth. The backup fuel was working. Holt walked among the tables and was almost pleased with himself, something that happened to him once a decade. That night, before setting out, Aaron climbed the hill to Krieger's grave. He stood there for a moment. He said aloud that he was going to finish the job and that the pass was now behind the two of them. Hardhome glowed below. He remembered the empty tower, the 4 cans of stew, and the man who had been counting down the days until starvation. That man wouldn't have believed a word of it. On the morning of the 4th day, the pass's tunnel welcomed them. Aaron. Darek, with 5 seasoned climbers belaying him further down the tunnel, both spheres on his chest. Teppel was waiting in the small chamber, Skull was waiting in the large one, and the entire valley was waiting, because this time they'd decided to maintain the contour differently. Skold said he would not accept the flow alone. He would spread it throughout the entire body of the world at once, across the lake, through the roots, across the fields. The world would accept it along with him. The heart entered the throat of the pass after noon. It came without an entourage. It had left the creatures below because in the narrow pass they were getting in its own way. It walked naked, and this made it even more terrifying. A mountain of light in the gorge filled everything, and the rocks cracked from its frost. And it knew where the gallery was. It hadn't gone 40 paces. It stopped at 80 and struck the gallery first. A lashing of white frost whipped against the stone canopy, and the canopy shattered like glass. Derek and his men were swept deep into the tunnel by an avalanche of debris. Aaron managed to fall behind a support pillar. A second blow knocked an entire section of wall out of the gallery, and the frost crept inward along the tunnel, groping for life. The plan had fallen apart. The heart was twice as far away as needed for the cascade. Aaron lay behind the pillar in the crumbling gallery and realized one simple thing. The pipe wasn't long enough. That meant he had to carry the pipe to the boiler. He stood up, and he walked out through the breach onto the open ice of the gorge toward the mountain of light. 80 paces. The frost cut through everything. At 60 paces, his lips stopped responding. Warmth flared up like a small sun within him, and heat spread from his chest throughout his body, restoring his breath. At 50 paces, struck him directly. Aaron saw the torch flying toward him and knew he couldn't dodge it. The torch didn't reach him. A wall of frost shot up from the snow before Aaron took the blow and crumbled. Skull. He couldn't become a giant, but he exhaled everything he'd gathered at the festival into the outline and fashioned a shield. A voice creaked in his head, uttering a single word. Go. Aaron walked on, 40 paces, 30. Each successive shield of frost grew thinner than the last. The warmth burned in his chest, no longer golden, but white. 20 steps. The light of his heart became the entire world. And Aaron raised both hands with the spheres, stepped into that light, and drew it in. The second cascade was nothing like the first. At the water pump, Aaron had a pipe through which a foreign stream flowed. Here, the stream became a war. The heart realized it was being drained and clung to the oncoming current with all the will of a whole winter. It wasn't just giving, it was clawing its way inward along the contour, into the small sphere, into Aaron, into the valley. Aaron stood on the ice, his feet frozen ankle deep, holding the war as it passed through his own chest. He felt both sides at once. He felt how, at the far end, Skold was unleashing a frenzied torrent across the lake, through the roots, across the fields, and how the world of the valley groaned as it accepted it. The water boiled with ice and thawed. The pines turned white with frost and shook it off. The world held firm. And he felt the small sphere near his heart where Teppel was doing the impossible. The newborn stood at the throat of the torrent like a living valve. He met with his own body everything that surged back along the contour. Heat against frost. He burned and would not let it through. His voice crackled in Aaron's head, no longer like logs, but like a forest fire. And in that voice there was no fear, only a stubbornness that was entirely childlike and entirely unyielding. 1 minute. Aaron could no longer feel his arms up to his shoulders. 2. The light of his heart sank downward. It stopped beating outward and poured everything into the battle for the boundary. 3 minutes. Aaron realized he was losing, not to his heart, to time. His body was giving out. His legs had died up to the knees. Black rivers swam before his eyes. The pipe held, but its supports were crumbling. And then he heard a third voice within the contour, not Skoll's, not Tepla's, voices, many, a distant rumble, like that of a square on a holiday. Skold opened the circuit into the valley, and the valley answered. Aaron didn't understand how it worked, and later no one could explain it in words, but he could feel them. Holt stood on the shore of the lake, his palm resting on the water. Marta, Derek, who had made his way out of the tunnel, Ingrid by the stove in Tikaya, Tim, the carpenter, 70 people from Westfall's garage. 400 people stood throughout the valley, pressing their palms to the ground, to the water, to the trees, and the world transmitted their warmth into the circuit just as a wire does. Not strength. There was no strength in the people. Warmth. That very same incomprehensible warmth of the living from which Skold had grown. It flowed through Aaron as a countercurrent, and the frost in his heart trembled for the first time. Aaron breathed in this shared warmth as if it were air, and he drew it in as he had never drawn it in before. Something in his heart broke with the sound of ice cracking under the weight of the world. It stopped fighting. The flow straightened out, and all the remaining power of the entire winter surged down the pipe in a single, long, descending waterfall. Through the white sphere of warmth, through Aaron, into the valley, into Skolda, into the lake, into the roots, into 400 pairs of palms. The light in the gorge faded slowly. A minute, 2, then it went out. Aaron stood on the ice in complete silence. Before him, an empty shell settled. No mountains, no radiance. A murky, melting hill. He tried to take a step and couldn't because his feet were frozen to the ice. So he simply let himself fall. They caught him. Derek and 2 hardened men were the first to reach him, and after that, his memories came in fragments. A stretcher, a tunnel, the warmth of transport. He woke up 2 days later in his home in Hartholm, and the first thing he saw was Martha's face, and the first thing he heard was laughter outside the window. The world had changed while he slept. The valley, after the second flood, hadn't just grown, it had become a country. Skold had channeled the power of a whole winter so that the horizon stretched for weeks' journey. Real mountains with snow-capped peaks had risen, which were now an adornment rather than a threat. Rivers began to flow. The sky learned to rain. Skold himself had changed as well. The frost within him remained in patterns across his shoulders. Now he was a tall being from the twilight, in which ice, bark, and water could be discerned, and when he walked through the valley, a strip of blossoms followed him across the ground. A wren found warmth in Tikaya. The small valley had survived, but its inhabitant had paid the price. Teppel was no longer a golden haze. After the valve, the childlike quality in him had burned out, leaving only a steady white glow, and he now spoke more slowly and deeply. Ingrid said that he had aged 10 years in 3 minutes, and and that she felt both proud and sad at the same time, just like any grandmother. Teppel replied that there was nothing to regret. He now knew why he had been born. A week later, when Aren was back on his feet, Skoll called him to the northern hills, to the place where he had once pointed out the 7 dots. The wall at the border had become transparent. 5 lights were now burning in the distant sky. 5, not 7, and they weren't moving. Skoll said that after the deaths of the 2 brothers, the rest had stopped. Winter knows how to count. They realized that here they were being killed, and killed by something they didn't understand. They would wait years, maybe decades. Winter is patient. But Skoll said something else too. Now, after the second overflow, he could sense more than just hearts. He could sense the planet. And far to the south, beyond the dead spaces, he heard faint, warm points. People, other survivors, many of them, in cities. They were clinging to life with their last ounce of strength in a world freezing to death, unaware that somewhere there was a country beneath glass where bread grew. Aren stood and looked at the 5 motionless lights in the northern sky and toward the south where the living were. The war was being postponed. Something greater than war was beginning. In the evening, the Council of 4 gathered in its former composition, minus 1 member and with 2 new ones. Now seated at the table were Skoll, who took a spot by the window because he didn't fit at the table, and a white sphere of warmth on a stand carved by the carpenter. Aren placed 2 items on the table, a map of the south drawn from Skoll's descriptions, and his own sphere. He said that winter had paused, and that this pause was a gift they couldn't afford to sleep through. He suggested spending it on the journey, gathering a caravan, traveling south from point to point, finding the living, and bringing them home. The world beneath the glass had grown large enough to accommodate everyone. And if, along the way, they found other dormant spheres in other collections on other shelves, those spheres would now have someone to teach the newborns. Out of habit, Holt asked about numbers and timelines. Aren replied that the number was 1, the number of people who would freeze to death for every month of their delay. Holt closed his notebook and said they had to set out in the spring, and no one at the table smiled at the word spring, even though just 3 years ago it would have been a mockery. Now they had spring, their very own, handmade. The caravan set out in the spring, just as Holt had decided, and from that day on began the count that would later be called the Years of Gathering. Aren led the first expedition himself, 3 draft animals, 20 hardened men, a frosty breath on his shoulder in the shape of a frost-covered bird, because he'd learned to leave a small part of himself outside without the cascade, and a sphere on his chest in which an entire country traveled. The South turned out to be more terrifying than the North. The North was dead, to be honest, but the South was dying a slow death. They found their first living city in the 6th week, the underground tunnels of the former subway system. 1,000 people in the darkness and soot, sharing the heat of the only surviving reactor, which had half a year left. They didn't believe Aren. They shot at him. Then they argued for 2 days. Then he produced a sphere in the palm of his hand, transported their elder inside to the lake shore, and brought him back, and the argument ended. 1,000 people entered the valley in a single night, marching in a column through the transfer hall, and Hearthholm welcomed them with bread in the square. Things went more smoothly from then on, because history now led the way ahead of the caravan. Rumors of the country under glass spread through the ruins faster than the trucks. By the end of the first year of gathering, 6,000 people lived in the valley. By the end of the third, 20,000. Cities sprang up on the banks of new rivers, and Holt grew his notebook into an entire department, grumbling that there was now more paper than there had ever been snow. The spheres were found as well. Aren had been right. Quite a few of them lay dormant on shelves and in display cases throughout the world, dead, waiting for the first light. Over the years of gathering, they found 11. Each was brought to life with a surge of energy. Each was inhabited, and for each one, Tepel himself selected a guardian because he understood better than anyone what the unborn needed. He said that a sphere needed not a guardian, but a hearth. In 8 of the spheres, the inhabitants eventually awoke, and all 8 took their place among people and became people, though not in their exact image. In one, a merrymaker awoke, like a summer downpour. In another, a silent one who smelled of a garden. Winter no longer had a monopoly on the gods. In the 12th year of the gathering, what they had both awaited and feared came to pass. 5 hearts in the north took flight, all at once. Skold convened a council that now numbered not 4, but 30, and it sat in the stone hall of the city of Priozersk. Skold said calmly that Winter had run out of time, and was advancing with all her remaining strength because she realized that time was working against her. With each passing year, the country beneath the glass grew, while her brothers slept. Derek unfurled the defense maps he had been preparing for 12 years, but then Tepel stood up. He had long since ceased to dwell solely in Tikaya, but traveled between the spheres as a white light, and they listened to him, just as they had listened to Skoll. He said that for 12 years he had been counting along with Holt, and the numbers told him this. They were no longer just Skoll or just Aaron. They were 9 beings of light, 11 spheres, and 100,000 people. And most importantly, they had something they hadn't had at the pass: understanding. The warmth of people breaks the solid winter. This has been proven twice, so why wait for 5 sieges? He proposed the unthinkable: to go out to meet them, with all the spheres, with all the beings, with the entire country as a single entity. Not to kill the hearts one by one, but to do to the 5 at once what they did to the second. To open up to them, not a war, but the greatest overflow in history, and to spill the solid winter across the 11 worlds, where it will be met and remelted by 100,000 living. The debate lasted 3 days. They decided to go out to meet them. The encounter took place 2 years later, on the Great Northern Plain beyond the edge of the Deadlands, and it was later described in books in such detail that Aaron laughed and said he himself had apparently never been there. He remembered something else. He remembered a line of 11 spheres in the snow, and 9 figures of light above them. He remembered 5 mountains of blue fire stretching across the horizon. He remembered standing in the center of the circle, no longer the sole practitioner, but one among many, because 20 people, whom he had trained over the years, now knew how to channel the energy. And he remembered the silence when it was all over, and not a single mountain remained on the plain, while the 11 spheres lay in the snow, heavy with the weight of the winters they had absorbed. And the sky above the dead earth was, for the first time in 15 years, simply the sky. Winter, as an enemy, ended that day. The frost remained. The frost was now simply the weather. And then something happened that not even Tepel, with all his calculations, could have foreseen. The worlds, having reached their full power, began to give back. Skoll was the first to sense that he could breathe warmth outward through the glass without losing it, and that the world outside was holding on to that warmth. The spheres were scattered across the continent and placed in the dead cities Vaughn, and year after year the glaciation began to recede around each one, first by a kilometer, then by 10. 20 years later, green land lay all around each sphere, and people began to come out and live in the open, not fleeing from warmth into the cold, but carrying the warmth with them. Aaron grew old through this labor, and one day he caught himself feeling happy. He was sitting on a hill above Hearthholm, which had become a city with towers and bridges. Below, the fair was bustling. Sailing ships were passing across the sea. Martha, with whom they had lived these lives side by side, sat nearby, mending her grandson's jacket and grumbling that Grandpa would catch a chill in his back again. On the neighboring hill stood Krieger's stone and Holt's stone. Holt, who had died at 90 over an unfinished notebook, and Ingrid's stone, beside which there was always a fresh bread, because that was the custom. In his final year, Aaron climbed the northern hills one last time. Skold came there on his own. They stood as they once had, just the two of them, and now gazed not at the lights of danger, but at the green lands stretching outward beyond the transparent wall. Aaron took the ball off his neck, the first one, the very same one from the empty apartment on the 9th floor. He hadn't carried the country within it for a long time, because the country lived in all realms at once. He wore it as one wears a memory. He asked Skoll what he would do in 1,000 years, when everyone who remembered winter was gone. Skold didn't answer right away. Then he said he would do what he'd been taught to do, rearrange the loaves so they'd bake better. Aaron laughed, and he laughed for a long time. Then he held out the sphere to Skold and said he was giving it back. Not a souvenir, a home. Let it stand on a rock by the lake so that anyone can come and remember how it all began. From a trinket on a shelf in the dead world that turned out to be warm, Skold accepted the sphere into his palm from the half-light as carefully as one would accept a child, and he said he would set it there, and that he would add a plaque with a single word, because this story doesn't deserve long words. Aaron asked which one. Skold replied, the beginning. Down in the valley the evening bell rang. Above Hearthholm, above the sea, above the 11 worlds, and above the green land beyond, the first stars were slowly coming to life. Real ones, because by that time they had long since learned how to make the sky genuine. Aaron stood there for another minute. Then he took Martha by the arm and walked down toward the bell. Dinner was getting cold, and everyone in the valley obeyed this rule, even the gods. The second cascade was nothing like the first. At the water wheel, Aaron had a pipe through which a foreign stream flowed. Here, the stream raged like a war. The heart realized it was being consumed and clung to the oncoming current with all the will of a whole winter. It wasn't just giving itself away, it was clawing its way inward along the contour, into the small sphere, into Aaron, into the valley. Aaron stood on the ice, his feet frozen ankle deep, and held the war passing through his own chest. He felt both sides at once. He felt how, at the far end, Skold was unleashing a frenzied torrent across the lake, over the roots, across the fields, and how the world of the valley groaned as it accepted it. The water boiled with ice and thawed. The pines were covered in frost and were shaking it off. The windows of the houses in Hearthholm were ringing. The world held firm. And he felt a small sphere near his heart, where Teppel was doing the impossible. The newborn stood at the throat of the torrent, a living valve. He met with his own body everything that was tearing back along the contour, heat against the frost. He burned and wouldn't let it through. His voice crackled in Aaron's head, no longer like logs, but like a forest fire. And in that voice, there was no fear, only a stubbornness that was entirely childlike and entirely unyielding. Teppel shouted through the crackling that Grandma had ordered him not to let the cold into the house, and he wouldn't let it. A minute. Aaron could no longer feel his hands up to his shoulders. His heart changed tactics. It stopped beating steadily and began to thud, searching for the pipe's rhythm. A thud, a pause, a thud. It was tuning in to the frequency at which the pipe would burst, just as the wind tunes in to the frequency of a bridge. Aaron sensed this plan in his gut and did the only thing he could. He began to disrupt his own rhythm, breathing erratically, taking ragged gasps. His former life came to his aid once more, in a fragment. Water hammer is countered not with rigidity, but with flexibility. He ceased to be a rigid pipe and became a flexible hose, and the heartbeats slid along him, finding no foothold. 2 minutes. The light of the heart sank downward. It stopped beating in all directions and poured everything into the battle for the contour. It grew dark in the gorge because all the light was drawn into the bundle between the heart and the man. 3 minutes. Aaron realized he was losing. Not to the heart, to time. His body was giving out. His legs were dead down to the knees. Black rivers flowed before his eyes. Through the black rivers, he saw something strange. He saw the gallery where Darek was digging his men out of the rubble and shouting something at him. There were no words. The sound had died away completely in the gorge. The pipe held, but its supports were crumbling. Aaron caught himself thinking that 4 cans of stewed meat would have been easier. The thought was foolish, and he clung to it as if it were a railing. Silly thoughts turned out to be warmer than serious ones. And then he heard a third voice in the circuit. Not scolds, not teplas, voices, many of them. A distant rumble, like that of a square on a holiday. Skoll did something they hadn't agreed upon, something he would never be able to fully explain in words for the rest of his life. He opened the circuit into the valley. He opened himself wide, and the valley responded. Aaron didn't understand how it worked, and later no one could explain it, but he could feel them, every single one. Holt stood on the shore of the lake with his palm resting on the water, and the water beneath his palm didn't freeze. Marta stood in Hartholm Square among hundreds of people, holding Tim's hand. Darek, having crawled out of the tunnel, pressed his broken palms against the rock face of the pass. Ingrid, in Tikaya, embraced her stove as one would embrace a person. The carpenter, 70 people from the Westfall garage, who a year ago hadn't believed in the sphere, the families of former convoy guards, the children whom Aaron had carried through the frost while they slept. 400 people stood throughout the valley, pressing their palms against the ground, the water, and the trees, and the world transmitted their warmth into the circuit just as a wire does. Not strength. There was no strength in the people, warmth. That very same inexplicable warmth of the living from which he had grown all these years. It flowed through Aaron in a countercurrent. It was varied, and he could distinguish it by its taste, just as one distinguishes voices. Holt's stubborn warmth, Ingrid's warmth, steady as the heat of baked bread, Darek's malicious, searing heat. And for the first time, the frost in his heart wavered. The whole of winter encountered something it had not faced in thousands of years. Not heat that can be frozen, not light that can be extinguished, a connection. 400 living beings bound together as one of their own free will. Winter had no defense against this. It knew how to divide and freeze them one by one, but against this clasped warmth, its jolts dissipated like blows against water. Aaron breathed in this shared warmth as if it were air. He straightened up, and he reached out as he had never reached out before. Something in his heart snapped with the sound of ice bursting under the weight of the world. The sound traveled not through the air but through the earth, and it was heard even in the valley. His heart stopped fighting. The flow straightened out, and all the remaining power of the whole winter surged down the pipe in a single, long, descending waterfall. Through the white sphere of warmth, who was now singing something wordless in his throat. Through Arena, who no longer understood where he ended and the outline began. Into the valley, into Skolda, into the lake, into the roots, into the 400 pairs of palms that felt the tamed winter pass through them and become spring on the other side of their skin. The light in the gorge faded slowly. A minute, 2, then it went out. Aaron stood on the ice in complete silence. An empty shell settled before him. No mountains, no radiance. A murky, melting hill from which the last sparks fell with a rustle and died out. He tried to take a step and couldn't because his feet were frozen into the ice up to his ankles. And then he simply let himself fall. They caught him. Darek and 2 hardened men were the first to reach him. They chopped at the ice at his feet with knives, cursing and laughing at the same time. After that, his memories were fragmented. A stretcher, a tunnel, Derek's face looking down at him, and his words that madmen should be tied up. The warmth of the transport. He woke up 2 days later in his home in Hartholm, and the first thing he saw was Martha's face, and the first thing he heard was laughter outside the window. The children were laughing. He lay there listening to that laughter for about 10 minutes before calling out to someone, because he'd never heard anything better in his life. The world had changed while he slept. After the second flood, the valley hadn't just grown, it had become a country. Skoll had channeled the power of an entire winter so that the horizon stretched for weeks' worth of travel. Real mountains with snow-capped peaks had risen, now serving as an adornment rather than a threat. Rivers began to flow, bearing names that the people had spent a week devising as a community, arguing and then making up. The sky learned to rain, and all of Hearthholm took to the streets to greet the first rain, standing beneath the downpour as if witnessing a miracle. Skold himself had changed as well. The frost within him remained only as patterns on his shoulders. Now he was a tall being of half-light, in which one could make out ice, bark, and water. And as he walked through the valley, a strip of blossoms, and the children ran after him on purpose so they could walk on the flowers. Aaron found warmth in Tikaya. The small valley had survived, but its inhabitant had paid the price. The warmth was no longer a golden haze. After the valve, the childlike quality in him burned out, leaving only a steady white glow, and he now spoke more slowly and deeply, and his words warmed the walls of the room. Ingrid said that he had aged 10 years in 3 minutes, and that she felt both proud and sad, just like any grandmother. Teppel replied that there was nothing to regret. He now knows why he was born. And then he asked her for bread with a crust, and Ingrid cried and laughed at the same time, because he had been asking for bread with a crust since the first day of his life. And that meant that, within the light of his newfound maturity, her former grandson was still alive. A week later, when Aaron was back on his feet, Skoll called him to the northern hills. There, where he had once pointed out the 7 dots. The wall at the border had become transparent. 5 lights were now burning in the distant sky. 5, not 7, and they weren't moving. Skold said that after the death of the 2 brothers, the rest had stopped. Winter knows how to count. They realized that here they were being killed, and killed by something they didn't understand. They would wait. Years, perhaps decades. Winter is patient. But Skold said something else as well. Now, after the second transition, he could sense more than just hearts. He could sense the entire planet as one senses one's own skin. And far to the south, beyond the dead spaces, he heard faint, warm points. People, other survivors, many, in cities. They were clinging to life with their last ounce of strength in a world freezing to death, unaware that somewhere there was a country beneath glass where bread grew. He listed directions and distances, and Aaron listened, feeling a familiar sensation rise within him, the very same thing that had once lifted him out of bed on the 47th day of the cold. The impossibility of sitting still when there was something to be done. The war was being postponed. Something greater than war was beginning. That evening, the Council of 4 gathered in its usual composition, minus 1 member and with 2 new ones. Now sitting at the table were Skoll, taking a seat by the window because he didn't fit at the table, and a white sphere of warmth on a stand carved by the carpenter. Krieger's seat was left empty, and Darek silently hung a charred belt from a tractor over the back of his chair. Thus a tradition was born in the council that would endure for centuries. 1 empty seat at any table where destinies are decided. Aaron placed 2 items on the table, a map of the South drawn from Skoll's descriptions, and his own sphere. He said that winter had paused, and that a pause is a gift one must not sleep through. He proposed spending it on the road, to assemble a caravan, to travel south from point to point, to find the living, to bring them home. The world beneath the glass had grown so much that it would accept everyone. And if, along the way, they found other sleeping spheres in other collections on other shelves, those spheres would now have someone to teach the newborn. Martha asked who would lead the first caravan, and looked at him in such a way that the question was not a question, but a test. Aaron replied that he would lead it himself and held her gaze. Holt, out of habit, asked about numbers and timelines. Aaron replied that the number was 1, the number of people who would freeze to death for every month of their delay. Holt stared at his notebook for a long time, then closed it and said they had to set out in the spring. And no one at the table smiled at the word spring, even though just 3 years ago it would have been a mockery. Now they had spring, their very own, handmade. Outside the council house window, evening hearth home bustled, and somewhere by Lake Scold, a strip of blossoms bloomed along the shore. And that was now simply part of the weather. The caravan set out in the spring, as Holt had decided, and from that day on began the count that would later be called the Years of Gathering. Aron led the first expedition himself. 3 draft animals, 20 hardened men. Skold's breath on his shoulder took the form of a frosty bird, because he had learned to leave a small part of himself outside without a cascade, and a sphere on his chest in which an entire country traveled. The farewell was brief, because Aron had forbidden long send-offs. Marta adjusted his straps, just as she had once done before setting out for the pass, and said that if he didn't return by harvest time, she would go after him herself and let him just try to stop her. Tim, now a grown man with his own boat and girlfriend, slipped a new figurine into his pocket. Not a wolf, a man with a staff. He said the wolf had served its purpose. The South turned out to be more terrifying than the North. The North was dead, to be honest, but the South was dying a slow death. The caravan passed through towns where the squares were littered with the charred remains of the last bonfires made of books and furniture. Through villages where, in the end, people weren't fighting over food, but over their place in line for warmth. Aron read all the diaries he found at first, but then stopped because he couldn't carry so many while walking. They found their first living city in the 6th week, the underground tunnels of the former subway system. 1,000 people in the darkness and soot, sharing the heat from the only surviving reactor, which, according to their engineers' calculations, had 6 months left. They didn't believe Aron. They fired at him from their posts, and a bullet whizzed past the tractor's armor. Then they argued for 2 days on a neutral platform. Their elder, a gaunt man whose eyes had long since grown accustomed to the darkness, said that over the past 15 years, people had come to them 4 times with promises, and all 4 times it had ended in bloodshed. Aron didn't argue with words. He held a sphere in the palm of his hand and transported the elder inside, to the lakeshore under the sun, and brought him back an hour later. The elder stood on the platform, and everyone looked at him, but he remained silent, and something was streaming down his dark face. Then he said 2 words to his people. "It's summer there," and the argument was over. 1,000 people entered the valley in a single night, marching in a column through the transfer hall, holding on to a taut rope, and Hartholm welcomed them with bread in the square. For the first few days, the newcomers squinted in the light and felt the grass with their hands as if they were blind. After that, things went more smoothly, because history now marched ahead of the caravan. Rumors of the country under glass spread through the ruins faster than the transport trucks. Communities along the way were already coming out to the roads themselves and lighting signal fires. By the end of the first year of settlement, 6,000 people lived in the valley. By the end of the third, 20,000. Cities sprang up along the banks of new rivers. The underground Westfall gave its name to the new Westfall on the southern shore of the sea. Holt grew his notebook into an entire department with 100 accountants and grumbled that there was more paper than there had ever been snow. But he grumbled with a smile. Spheres were found as well. Aron turned out to be right. All over the world, on shelves and in display cases, there were dead ones, waiting for the first light. Over the years of collecting, they found 11. 1 in a bank vault, 1 in a snow-filled children's room, where it kept 2 surviving cats warm. And those cats went down in history as the first to be saved by a sphere without the sphere's knowledge. Each was brought to life with a surge of light. Each was inhabited, and for each, Teppel himself selected a guardian, because he understood better than anyone what an unborn being needed. He said that a sphere needed not a watchman, but a hearth. That light must take shape to the sounds of a living home, amid arguments, lullabies, and the clatter of spoons. Over time, the inhabitants of the 8 spheres awoke, and all 8 took shape among people and became people. real, though not in their image. In one, a merrymaker awoke, like a summer downpour, who tangled the laundry on the lines and mended roofs. In another, a silent one who smelled of a garden, who spoke only in the third year, and immediately in verse. In the third, twins of light, who could not agree on the color of their own sky, and the guardian reconciled them as one reconciles brothers. Winter no longer had a monopoly on the gods. People learned to cultivate their own, from warmth, daily life, and fairy tales. Teppel called this the most important craft of all that human hands had ever devised. In the 12th year of gathering, what they had both awaited and feared came to pass. 5 hearts in the north took flight, all at once. Skuld convened a council that was no longer of 4, but of 30, which sat in the stone hall of the city of Priozersk, and an empty chair stood there as well. Skuld said calmly that winter had run out of time and was advancing with all its remaining strength because it realized that time was working against it. With each passing year, the country beneath the glass grew, while its brothers slept and lost territory after territory in the south, where the spheres were already beginning to radiate heat outward. Darek, aged but steadfast, unfurled the defense maps he had been preparing for 12 years. Front lines, new generation bonfire fields, calculations for 5 sieges. But Teppel stood up. He had long since ceased to live solely in Tikaya, but traveled between the spheres as a white light, and they listened to him just as they had listened to Skuld. He said that for 12 years he had been counting along with Holt, and the numbers tell us this. They are no longer just Skoll and Aren. They are 9 beings of light, 11 spheres, 100,000 people, and 20 transmitters trained by Aren. And most importantly, they have something that was missing at the pass: understanding. The warmth of the people breaks the solid winter. This has been proven twice. United warmth is invincible to those who know only how to divide. So why wait for 5 sieges and risk everything 5 times? He proposed the unthinkable, to go out to meet them, with all the spheres, all the beings, the entire country as a single entity. Not to kill hearts one by one, but to do to the 5 at once what was done to the second. To open up to them, not with war, but with the greatest overflow in history, and to spill the solid winter across 11 worlds, where it will be met and remelted by 100,000 living beings. The debate lasted 3 days. Derek argued that staking everything on a single operation was madness. Teppel replied that keeping 100,000 people waiting 20 years for 5 wars is even greater madness, and that fear is a poor guide. On the 3rd day, the profound old woman Ingrid, who had been brought into the hall in a chair, spoke up. She said she had lived through both winter and spring, and the difference was simple. Winter is when everyone warms only themselves, and if they now decided to defend themselves one front at a time, then winter had already won halfway in their minds. They decided to march out. The encounter took place 2 years later on the great northern plain beyond the edge of the Deadlands, and it was later described in books in such detail that Aren laughed and said he himself had apparently never been there. He remembered something else. He remembered how, for 2 years, the country had prepared, not hiding its preparations out of fear, but turning them into a shared endeavor, accompanied by the songs of the supply trains. He remembered the line of 11 spheres in the snow on stone pedestals, the 9 figures of light above them, and Skuld in the center, no longer frost-covered, but almost transparent from the depth he had gathered. He remembered the 5 mountains of blue fire stretching across the entire horizon, which had been moving and then stopped. For the first time in history, winter itself had stopped before the people because it did not understand what it was seeing. He remembered standing in the center of the circle, no longer the leader, but one among many, because his students stood beside him, holding their bundles, and he was simply the oldest of the 20. He remembered the voice of the valley behind him, 100,000 palms on the ground, stretching from the plain all the way to Hartholm along a chain of cities. And he remembered how 5 whole winters surged into the circle he had opened to meet them, first as war, then as bewilderment, then simply as a torrent, because against the bound heat of 100,000 100,000, the ancient cold had nothing but strength, and they knew how to take that strength from it. The overflow lasted from dawn to dusk, and he remembered the silence when it was all over, and not a single mountain remained on the plain, while 11 spheres lay heavy with the gathered winters. And the sky above the dead earth was, for the first time in 15 years, simply the sky. One of the young, hardened men took off his hat, and one by one, in a chain, they all took off their hats and stood there, without having agreed to do so. Winter, as an enemy, ended that day. The frost remained. The frost was now simply the weather, and the children of future generations built fortresses out of it. And then something happened that not even Teppel, with all his calculations, could have imagined. The worlds, having reached their full strength, began to give back. Skoll was the first to sense that he could breathe warmth out through the glass without losing it, and that the world outside was holding on to that warmth, because the remelted winter had become something new within the spheres, a cycle. The spheres were scattered across the continent and placed in the squares of dead cities, and year after year, the glaciation began to recede around each one, first by a kilometer, then by 10. Rivers broke open. The earth emerged from beneath the ice, and the earth remembered how to give birth. 20 years later, a green land lay all around each sphere, and people began to come out and live in the open. Not to flee from warmth into the cold, but to carry warmth with them. And this became the chief law of the new era, one that was never written down because everyone knew it. Aron grew old in the course of this work, and one day he caught himself realizing that he was happy. He was sitting on a hill above Hearthholm, which had become a city, with towers and bridges and a university, where, during the first lecture to freshmen, a snow globe and asked what it was. Down below, the fair was bustling. Sailing ships were passing across the sea. Martha, with whom they had lived these lives side by side, sat nearby, mending her grandson's jacket and grumbling that Grandpa would catch a chill in his back again. Her grandson was running up and down the slope with a wooden figurine holding a staff. Tim's figurines had become a family heirloom. On the neighboring hill stood Krieger's stone, where the hardened veterans always gathered on the anniversary of the pass. And there was Holt's stone. He had died at 90 over an unfinished notebook, which his students had completed and placed a copy of beneath the stone. And there was Ingrid's stone, where fresh bread always lay because that was the custom, and no one could remember who had placed it there first. In his final year, Aron climbed the northern hills one last time. He walked slowly with his walking stick and waved away his great-grandchildren, who wanted to take him by the arms. Skold came there on his own. They stood as they once had, just the two of them, and now gazed not at the fires of danger, but at the green lands stretching outward beyond the transparent wall to the horizon, where the chimneys of the outer cities smoldered. Aron took the orb from around his neck, the first one, the very one from the empty apartment on the 9th floor. He hadn't carried the country within it for a long time, because the country lived in all spheres at once, and in the land outside. He carried it as one carries a memory. The glass was warm. It had always been warm all these years, just like on the first day. He asked Skold what he would do in 1,000 years, when everyone who remembered winter was gone. Skold didn't answer right away. He looked out at the valley, and the light on his face was deep and calm, like the evening sky over a harvest. Then he said he would do what he had been taught to do. He'd turn the loaves so they'd bake better. Aron laughed, and he laughed long and easily, the way people laugh when everything is done. Then he held out the ball to Skold and said he was giving it back. Not a souvenir, a home. Let it stand on a rock by the lake so that everyone can come up to it and remember how it all began. With a trinket on a shelf in the dead world that turned out to be warm. With a man who was freezing and refused to give in. Skold accepted the sphere into his palm from the half-light as carefully as one would accept a child. And he said he would set it there, and that he would add a plaque to it with a single word, because this story doesn't deserve long words. Aaron asked which one. Scold replied, "The beginning." They stood there a little longer. There was nothing more to say, and that was fine. Down in the valley, the evening bell tolled. Above Hearthholme, above the sea, above the 11 worlds, and above the green land beyond, the first stars were slowly coming out. Real ones. Because by that time, they had long since learned how to make the sky genuine. Aaron stood there for another minute, watching the lights come on in the windows and the smoke rise from the chimneys, carrying the scent of bread throughout the world. Then he took Martha by the arm and went downstairs to the sound of the bell. Dinner was getting cold, and everyone in the valley obeyed this rule.